as Supreme Court Judge Leibovitz of New York State wrote in Life magazine after having visited Gulag. In serving out his term of punishment, the prisoner retains a feeling of dignity. That is what he comprehended and saw. Oh, fortunate New York State to have such a perspicacious jackass for a judge. And oh, you well-fed, devil-may-care, near-sighted, irresponsible foreigners with your notebooks and your ballpoint pens, beginning with those correspondents who back in Chem asked the Zek's questions in the presence of the camp chiefs. How much you have harmed us in your vain passion to shine with understanding in areas where you did not grasp a lousy thing. Human dignity of persons condemned without trial, who are made to sit down beside Stolypin cars at stations with their rear ends in the mud, who, at the whistle of the citizen jailer's lash, scrape up with their hands the urine-soaked earth and carry it away, so as not to be sentenced to the punishment block. Of those educated women who, as a great honor, have been found worthy of laundering the linen of the citizen chief of the camp, and of feeding his privately owned pigs, and who, at his first drunken gesture, have to make themselves available, so as not to perish on general work the next day. Fire, fire! The branches crackle, and the night wind of late autumn blows the flame of the bonfire back and forth. The compound is dark. I am alone at the bonfire, and I can bring it still more carpenter's shavings. The compound here is a privileged one, so privileged that it is almost as if I were out in freedom. This is an island of paradise. This is the Marfino Sharashka, a scientific institute staffed with prisoners, in its most privileged period. No one is overseeing me, calling me to a cell, chasing me away from the bonfire. I am wrapped in a padded jacket, and even then it is chilly in the penetrating wind. But she, who has already been standing in the wind for hours, her arms straight down, her head drooping, weeping, then growing numb and still, and then again she begs piteously, "Citizen Chief, forgive me. Please forgive me. I won't do it again." The wind carries her moan to me, just as if she were moaning next to my ear. The citizen chief at the gatehouse fires up his stove and does not answer. This was the gatehouse of the camp next door to us, from which workers came into our compound to lay water pipes and to repair the old ramshackle seminary building. Across from me, beyond the artfully intertwined, many-stranded barbed wire barricade, and 2 steps away from the gatehouse, beneath a bright lantern, stood the punished girl, head hanging, the wind tugging at her grey work skirt, her feet growing numb from the cold, a thin scarf over her head. It had been warm during the day when they had been digging a ditch on our territory, and another girl, slipping down into a ravine, had crawled her way to the Vladikino highway and escaped. The guard had bungled, and Moscow city buses ran right along the highway. When they caught on, it was too late to catch her. They raised the alarm. A mean, dark major arrived, and shouted that if they failed to catch the fugitive girl, the entire camp would be deprived of visits and parcels for a whole month because of her escape. And the women brigadiers went into a rage, and they were all shouting, one of them in particular, who kept viciously rolling her eyes. "Oh, I hope they catch her, the bitch! I hope they take scissors and clip, clip, take off all her hair in front of the line-up." This wasn't something she had thought of herself. This was the way they punished women in Gulag. But the girl who was now standing outside the gatehouse in the cold had sighed and said instead, "At least she can have a good time out in freedom for all of us." The jailer overheard what she said, and now she was being punished. Everyone else had been taken off to the camp, but she had been set outside there to stand at attention in front of the gatehouse. This had been at 6 p.m., and it was now 11 p.m. She tried to shift from one foot to another, but the guard stuck out his head and shouted, "Stand at attention, whore, or else it will be worse for you." And now she was not moving, only weeping. "Forgive me, Citizen Chief. Let me into the camp. I won't do it any more." But even in the camp, no one was about to say to her, "All right, idiot, come on in. The reason they were keeping her out there so long was that the next day was Sunday, and she would not be needed for work. Such a straw-blonde, naive, uneducated slip of a girl. She had been imprisoned for some spool of thread. What a dangerous thought you expressed there, little sister. They want to teach you a lesson for the rest of your life. Fire, fire. We fought the war, and we looked into the bonfires to see what kind of a victory it would be. The wind wafted a glowing husk from the bonfire. To that flame, and to you, girl, I promise, the whole wide world will read about you. This was happening at the end of 1947, a few days before the 30th anniversary of the October Revolution, in our capital city of Moscow, which had just celebrated 800 years of its cruelties, little more than a mile away from the All-Union Agricultural Fairgrounds, and a half-mile away from the Ostankino Museum of Serf Arts and Handicrafts. Serfs. This comparison occurred to many when they had had the time to think about it, and not accidentally either. Not just individual features, but the whole central meaning of their existence was identical for serfdom and the archipelago. They were forms of social organization for the forced and pitiless exploitation of the unpaid labor of millions of slaves. 6 days a week, and often 7, the natives of the archipelago went out to fatiguing barshchina, forced labor, which did not bring them even the least little return. They were allowed neither a 5th day nor even a 7th in which to work for themselves, because their sustenance was a mesyachina, a monthly serf ration, a camp ration. They were divided just as precisely into the categories of those paying their dues in the form of forced labor, Group A, and the household serfs, Group B, who directly served the estate owner, chief of the camp, and the estate, the compound. Only those totally unable to get down from their peasant stoves, board bunks, were recognized as infirm, Group C, and similarly there were punishments for offenders, Group D, except for the difference that the estate owner, acting in his own interests, punished with a lash in the stable and the loss of fewer work days, and he had no punishment block, whereas, in accordance with state instructions, the chief of the camp placed the culprit in the shizo, the penalty isolator, or the BUR, the strict regimen barracks. Like the estate owner, the chief of camp could take any slave to be his lackey, cook, barber, or jester, and he could also assemble a serf theatre if he wished. He could take any slave woman as a housekeeper, a concubine, or a servant. Like an estate owner, he could play tricks and show his temper as much as he liked. The chief of the Khimki camp, Major Volkov, noticed that a girl prisoner was drying her long flaxen locks in the sun after washing them, and for some reason this made him angry, and he shouted, "Cut off her hair!" And they immediately cut all her hair off. That was in 1945. And whenever the camp chief or the estate owner changed, all the slaves obediently awaited the new master, made guesses about his habits, and surrendered in advance to his power. Being incapable of foreseeing what the will of the master would be, the serf took little thought for the morrow, nor did the prisoner. The serf could not marry without the master's permission, and it was even more the case that a prisoner could acquire a camp wife only with the indulgence of the camp chief. Just as a serf had not chosen his slave's fate, since he was not to blame for his birth, neither did the prisoner choose his. He also got into the archipelago by pure fate. This similarity has long since been discerned by the Russian language. Have you fed the people? Have you sent the people out to work? How many people do you have there? Send me one person. People. People. Whom do they mean? That's the way they talked about serfs, and that is how they speak about prisoners. And that is also the way they talk about the collective farmers and unskilled laborers, but we are not going to carry this any further. One cannot speak like that about officers or leaders, however. How many people do you have? No one would understand you. But there are some who will object that nonetheless there are really not so many similarities between serfs and prisoners. There are more differences. And we agree with that, there are more differences. But what is surprising is that all the differences are to the credit of serfdom. All the differences are to the discredit of the Gulag Archipelago. The serfs did not work longer than from sunrise to sunset. The zeks started work in darkness and ended in darkness, and they didn't always end either. For the serfs, Sundays were sacred, and the 12 sacred Orthodox holidays as well, and local saints' days, and a certain number of the 12 days of Christmas. They went about in mummers' costumes. The prisoner was fearful on the eve of every Sunday. He didn't know whether they would get it off. And he never got holidays at all, just as the Volga didn't get any days off, remember? Those 1sts of May and those 7ths of November involved more miseries with searches and special regimen than the holidays were worth, and a certain number were put into punishment blocks every year precisely on those very days. For the serfs, Christmas and Easter were genuine holidays, and as for a body search, either after work or in the morning or at night, stand next to your cots, the serfs knew not of these. The serfs lived in permanent huts, regarding them as their own, and when at night they lay down on top of their stoves or on their sleeping platform between ceiling and stove, their polati, or else on a bench, they knew, this is my own place. I have slept here forever and ever, and I always will. The prisoner did not know what barracks he would be in on the morrow, and even when he returned from work he could not be certain that he would sleep in that place that night. He did not have his own sleeping shelf, or his own multiple bunk. He went wherever they drove him. The serf on barshchina, or forced labor, had his own horse, his own wooden plough, axe, scythe, spindle, chests, dishes, and clothes. Even the household serfs, as Herzen writes, always had some clothes of their own, which they could leave to their nearest and dearest, and which were almost never taken away by the estate owner. In spring, the zek was forced to turn in his winter clothing, and in the autumn to turn in his summer clothing. At inventories they emptied his bag and took away for the government every extra piece of clothing. He was not permitted to have even a small penknife or a bowl, and as far as livestock was concerned, only lice. One way or another a serf would cast his line and catch a fish. The zek caught fish only with a spoon, and only in his gruel. The serf had a little cow named Brownie, or at least a goat and chickens. The zek's lips never touched milk, and he'd never seen hen's eggs for whole decades, and probably he'd not recognized them if he did. Old Russia, which experienced Asiatic slavery for 7 whole centuries, did not, for the most part, know famine. In Russia, no one has ever died of starvation, said the proverb. And a proverb is not made up out of lies and nonsense. The serfs were slaves, but they had full bellies. There is testimony on this for all the Russian centuries. In the 17th, Yuri Khrizanich wrote that the peasants and artisans of Muscovy lived more bountifully than those of the West, that the poorest inhabitants in Russia ate good bread, fish, meat. Even in the time of troubles, the long-preserved granaries had not been exhausted. There were stacks standing in the fields. Threshing floors were filled full with specially stacked sheaves and stooks and haystacks for from 4 to 10 years. Avrami Palitsin. In the 18th century, Fonvidzin, comparing the standard of living of the Russian peasants with that of the peasants of Languedoc-Provence, wrote, "I find, objectively judging things, that the state of our peasants is incomparably happier." In the 19th century, Pushkin wrote of the serf village, "The evidence of abundance and work is everywhere." The archipelago lived for decades in the grip of cruel famine, the Zeks would scuffle over a herring tail from the garbage pail. For Christmas and Easter, even the thinnest serf peasant broke his fast with fat bacon. But even the best work in camp could get fat bacon only in parcels from home. The serfs lived in families. The sale or exchange of a serf away from his family was a universally recognized and proclaimed barbarism. Popular Russian literature waxed indignant over this. Hundreds of serfs, perhaps thousands, but this is unlikely, were torn from their families, but not millions. The Zek was separated from his family on the first day of his arrest, and, in 50% of all cases, forever. If a son was arrested with his father, as we heard from Vitkovsky, or a wife together with her husband, the greatest care was taken to see that they did not meet at the same camp. And if by some chance they did meet, they were separated as quickly as possible. Similarly, every time a man and a woman Zek came together in camp for fleeting or real love, they hastened to penalize them with the punishment cell, to separate them and send them away from one another. And even the most sentimental of our writing ladies, Marietta Shaginian or Tatiana Tess, never let fall a single silent tear into their kerchiefs about that. Well, of course, they didn't know, or else thought it was necessary. And even the herding of serfs from one place to another didn't occur in a frenzy of haste. They were permitted to pack their goods and chattels, to gather up their movables, and to move calmly a score or so of miles away. But a prisoner transport would hit the Zek like a sudden squall, 20 minutes or 10, just time enough to turn in camp property, and his entire life would be turned upside down, and he would go off somewhere to the ends of the earth, maybe forever. In the life of one serf there was hardly ever more than one move, and most often they stayed put. But a native of the archipelago, unfamiliar with prisoner transports, couldn't have been found, and many Zeks were moved 5, 7, 11 times. Some serfs managed to escape to the freer obrok system, a fixed money payment to the serf owner, and the obrok serfs might travel far out of sight of the cursed master, go into trade, enrich themselves, and live like free people. But even the Zeks, privileged enough to go about without convoy, lived inside that same camp compound, and had to drag themselves early in the morning to the very same type of work to which the column of the other Zeks was driven. The household serfs were, for the most part, degenerate parasites. Servants are a boorish spawn, as the saying goes. They lived off the labor of the Barshchina serfs, but at least they themselves did not rule over the Barshchina serfs. It was doubly nauseating for the Zek that, in addition to everything else, the degenerate trustees directed them and ordered them around. And in general, the entire situation of the serfs was alleviated by the fact that the estate owner had necessarily to be merciful to them. They were worth money. Their work brought him wealth. The camp chief was merciless to the prisoners. He had not bought them, and he would not be willing them to his children. And if they died, others would be sent him. No, we got ourselves involved to no purpose in comparing our Zeks with the serfs of the estate owners. The situation of the latter, one has to admit, was very much less harried and more humane. A closer comparison of the situation of the natives of the archipelago would be with the factory serfs of the Urals, the Altai and Nerchinsk, or the inhabitants of the Arakchayev semi-military settlements. Some people object, however, even to this. They, too, had it good. In the Arakchayev settlements there were also nature, family, and holidays. Only the slavery of the ancient East is a fair comparison. And there is only one, just one, plus which comes to mind on the side of the Zeks as opposed to the serfs. The prisoner might land in the archipelago even as a juvenile of 12 to 15, but not from the very date of his birth. He did at least snatch a number of years in freedom before imprisonment. As for the advantage of a definite sentence in comparison with the lifetime of peasant serfdom, there are many qualifications. namely if the term was not a quarter, 25 years, if the article was not 58, if he wasn't until special orders, if they didn't paste a second term on the prisoner in camp, if at the end of his term the prisoner was not automatically sent off into exile, if the prisoner after being released was not sent straight back to the archipelago as a repeater. There is such a fence of qualifications, in fact, that after all it is only fair to recall that sometimes the nobleman master too might manumit his serf out of whimsy. That is why, when the Emperor Mikhail informed us at the Lubyanka about the anecdotal deciphering of the initials of the Soviet Bolshevik Party, VKPB, current among Moscow workers at that time as Vtorye Krepostnoye Pravo, Bolsheviks, Second Serfdom, Bolsheviks.
This book is continued on Cassette 5, Side 1.
The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2, Section 1, continued.
Cassette 5, Side 1.
That is why, when the Emperor Mikhail informed us at the Lubyanka about the anecdotal deciphering of the initials of the Soviet Bolshevik Party, VKPB, current among Moscow workers at that time as Vtorye Krepostnoye Pravo, Bolsheviks, Second Serfdom, Bolsheviks. This did not seem to us so much funny as prophetic. They sought a new stimulus for socially useful labor. They thought originally it would be found in conscientiousness and enthusiasm, along with material disinterestedness. And that is why they seized so eagerly on the great example of the Subotniki, voluntary Saturdays. But this turned out not to be the beginning of a new era, but a tremor of self-sacrifice on the part of one of the last generations of the revolution. It can be seen, for example, from provincial materials in Tambov, that in 1921 many members of the party were already trying to get out of the Subotniki, and a mark was introduced in the party record book for participation in Subotniki. Yes, this outburst lasted another decade, enough for the Komsomols and us, the young pioneers of those times. But then it came to an end for us too. And what was next? Where was the stimulus to be sought? Money? Peace rates? Bonus payments? But all of that carried the acrid smell of recent capitalism, and a long period was required, another generation, for that smell to cease to irritate, so it could be peaceably accepted as the socialist principle of material incentive. They dug down deeper into the storage chest of history and dragged out what Marx had called extra economic coercion. In camp and on collective farms, this discovery was presented with bared fangs. And then Frenkel came along, and, like a devil sprinkling a poison potion into the boiling cauldron, he poured in the differentiated ration pot. There was a famous incantation repeated over and over again. In the new social structure there can be no place for the discipline of the stick on which serfdom was based, nor the discipline of starvation on which capitalism is based. And there you are. The archipelago managed miraculously to combine the one and the other. All in all, the particular techniques required for this totaled 3. 1, the differentiated ration pot. 2, the brigade. And 3, 2 sets of bosses. But the third of these was not absolutely necessary. At Vorkuta, for example, there was only 1 set of bosses, and things hummed. And so it was that the archipelago rested on these 3 whales, these 3 pillars, or, if one considers them the driving belts, they certainly made the wheels turn. We have already explained about the differentiated ration pot. This was a redistribution of bread and cereals aimed at making our Zek beat his head against the wall and break his back for the average prisoner's ration, which in parasitical societies is issued to an inactive prisoner. To fix it, so that our Zek could get his own lawful ration only in extra dollops of 3.5 ounces, and by being considered a shock worker. Percentages of output above 100 conferred the right to supplementary spoonfuls of kasha, those previously taken away. What a merciless knowledge of human nature! Neither those pieces of bread nor those cereal patties were comparable with the expenditure of strength that went into earning them. But as one of his eternal disastrous traits, the human being is incapable of grasping the ratio of an object to its price. For a cheap glass of vodka, a soldier is roused to attack in a war not his own, and lays down his life. In the same way, the Zek, for those paupers' handouts, slips off a log, gets dunked in the icy freshet of a northern river, or kneads clay for mud huts barefoot in icy water, and because of this those feet are never going to reach the land of freedom. However, the satanical, differentiated ration pot was not all-powerful. Not everyone took the bait, just as serfs at one time or another grasped the truth that you may have to eat less, but at least you won't have to break your back working. So the Zeks, too, understood. In camp it was not the small ration that killed people, but the big one. Lazy, stupid, insensible half-animals. They don't want that supplementary allotment of rations. They don't want a piece of that nourishing bread made from a mix of potatoes, vetch, and water. They don't want to be released ahead of term. They don't even want to be posted on the Board of Honor. They don't want to rise to the interests of the construction project in the country. They don't want to fulfill the 5-year plans, even though the 5-year plans are in the interests of the workers. They wander about the nooks and crannies of the mines on the floors of construction projects, and they are delighted to hide from the rain in a dark hole, just anything, in order not to work. Not often is it possible to arrange such mass labor projects as in the gravel pit near Yaroslavl. There, hundreds of prisoners are clumped together in a small area visible to the naked eyes of the supervisors, and hardly has any one of them stopped moving than he is immediately conspicuous. These are ideal conditions. No one even dares to slow down, to straighten his back, to wipe off the sweat, until up on the hill the flag drops, the signal for a smoking period. How, then, is it to be managed in other cases? Much thought was applied, and the brigade was invented. Yes, and for that matter, how could we fail to invent it? In our country, even the Narodniki, the populists, wanted to enter into socialism through the Obshchina, the peasant commune, and the Marxists through the collective. And what do our newspapers write even nowadays? The main thing for a human being is work, and it must be work in a collective. And in camp there is nothing but work, and only in a collective. Does that mean that the corrective labor camp is the highest goal of humanity? That the main thing has been attained? How the brigade serves the psychological enrichment of its members, the prodding, the surveillance, and the heightened sense of dignity, we have already had cause to explain in Chapter 3. Consistent with the purposes of the brigade, worthy tasks and brigadiers, known in camp lingo as bugri, in other words, lumps, are selected. Slave driving the prisoners with club and ration, the brigadier has to cope with the brigade in the absence of the higher-ups, the supervisors, and the convoy. Shalamov cites examples in which the whole membership of the brigade died several times over in the course of one gold-washing season on the Kolyma, but the brigadier remained the same. That was the kind of brigadier Perilamov was in Kermelag. He did not use his tongue, merely his stave. The list of these names would take up many pages here, but I have not compiled it. It is of interest that this kind of brigadier most often came from the thieves, that is, from the lumpen proletariat. However, what is there to which people cannot adapt? It would be crude on our part not to look closely and observe how the brigade sometimes became a natural constituent cell of the native society of the archipelago, of the same kind that the family is in freedom. I myself knew such brigades, and more than one, too. True, these were not brigades on general work, where someone had to die because otherwise the rest could not survive. These were usually special brigades: electricians, lathe operators, carpenters, painters. The fewer their members, some 10 or 12 persons, the more clearly the principle of mutual protection and mutual support appeared in them. This was manifested, too, in big brigades made up of various trades, but only in the hard labor camps and under special conditions. More about this in Part 5. For such a brigade, and for such a role, there also had to be a suitable brigadier, moderately hard, well acquainted with all the moral, immoral laws of Gulag, perspicacious and fair within the brigade, with his own well-worked-out method of coping with the higher-ups, whether it be a hoarse bark or a quiet and underhanded approach. He had to be feared by all the trustees, and let no opportunity go by to grab off for the brigade an extra 3½ ounces, padded trousers, a pair of shoes. But he also had to have connections among the influential trustees, from whom he could learn all the camp news and impending changes. He needed this for correct leadership. He had to know the work well and the sectors which were advantageous and disadvantageous, and be adept at shoving the neighboring brigade, if there was a neighboring brigade, onto the disadvantageous sectors. With a sharp eye out for the chances of tuchta, and sensing where best to grab it off within a particular 5-day work period, whether through manipulating work norms or total volume, and defend this unwaveringly against the work assigner when the latter was already waiting with splattering fountain pen to cut back the worksheets, and adroit at greasing the paw of the norm setter, and knowing who in his brigade was a stoolie, and if this stoolie was not very smart or malicious, then leaving him alone, since otherwise they'd send in a worse one. And he always had to know whom in the brigade he should encourage with a glance, and whom to curse out, and to whom to give a lighter job that particular day. And a brigade like that, with a brigadier like that, adapts itself to austerity and survives austerely. There is no tenderness here, but no one dies. I worked with brigadiers like that, with Sinebruyakov and Pavel Boronyuk, and if I were to compile a list of others like them, it would be many pages long. And on the basis of many different stories, there is a consensus that such efficient and intelligent brigadiers most often originated from among the Kulak sons. But what was there to do? If they implacably forced the brigade on the Zeks as a form of existence, then what was to be done? It was necessary somehow to adapt to it, was it not? We will die from the work, but we are able to survive only by working. Of course, this is a questionable philosophy. A better answer would be, don't teach me to die the way you want, but let me die the way I want. But they won't allow you to anyway. That's what... And the choice, facing the brigadier, could be difficult also. If the logging brigade failed to fulfill the day's norm of 72 cubic yards, the brigadier went into the punishment block too. And if you don't want to go to the punishment block, then drive your brigade members to their deaths. Bow down to the stronger. And the two sets of bosses were also convenient, in just the same way that pliers need both a right and left jaw. Two bosses. These were the hammer and the anvil, and they hammered out of the Zek what the state required, and when he broke, they brushed him into the garbage bin. Even though the maintenance of a separate administration for the camp compound greatly increased the state's expenditures, and even if out of stupidity, caprice, and vigilance it often complicated the working process, nevertheless they put it there anyway, and this was no mistake. Two bosses. This was two tormentors instead of one, in shifts too, and placed in a situation of competition to see who could squeeze more out of the prisoner and give him less. Production, materials, tools, transportation were in the hands of one boss. All that was lacking was manpower. This manpower was brought in every morning by the convoy from the camp and taken away to the camp every evening, or in shifts. During those 10 or 12 hours during which the Zeks were in the hands of the production bosses, there was no need to educate them or correct them. And even if they dropped dead during the course of the workday, this wouldn't disappoint either administration. Corpses could be written off more easily than burned-up boards or stolen linseed oil. It was important for the production bosses to compel the prisoners to do more work in a day and to credit them with less in their worksheets, because it was necessary to make up somehow for all the fatal over-expenditures and shortages on the production side, because the trusts were engaged in stealing, and so were the construction and installation administration, and the construction superintendents, and the foremen, and the worksite superintendents, and the truck drivers, and the Zeks least of all, and then not for themselves, for they had nowhere to take the stuff, but for their camp chiefs and their convoy. And still more than all of that put together was lost through careless and negligent management, and also because the Zeks didn't take good care of anything either, and there was just one way to make up for all these shortages: underpayment for manpower. The camp administration, on the other hand, controlled the workforce alone, Rabsila. The tongue certainly knows how to abbreviate. But this was the decisive factor. The camp chiefs, in fact, used to say, "We can squeeze them," the production administration, "because they can't find other workers anywhere else." Where could you find manpower in the taiga and the desert? Consequently, they sought to squeeze more money out in return for the Rabsila, which in part was turned over to the government, but in part went for the maintenance of the camp administration itself, in return for its guarding the Zeks from freedom, providing them with food and drink, dressing them, and morally harassing them. Just as always in our well-thought-out social system, two different plans collided head-on here, too. The production plan, whose objective was to have the lowest possible expenditures for wages, and the MVD plan, whose objective was to extract the largest possible earnings from camp production. To an observer on the sidelines, it seems strange. Why set one's own plans in conflict with one another? Oh, but there is a profound meaning in it. Conflicting plans flatten the human being. This is a principle which far transcends the barbed wire of the archipelago. And what is also important is that these two sets of bosses are by no means hostile to each other, as one might think from their constant squabbles and mutual deceits. Where it is necessary to flatten someone thoroughly, they close ranks very tightly, and even though the camp chief is the Zek's dear father, yet he always willingly recognizes and signs an official affidavit that the Zek himself was to blame for his own injury, and not the contractor. He will not be very insistent on the Zeks having work clothes, nor demand ventilation in some section of a plant where there is none. Well, if there isn't, there isn't, and what can you do? These are temporary difficulties. And what about the Siege of Leningrad? The camp chief will never refuse the production boss when he is asked to jail a brigadier in the punishment block for rudeness, or a worker for having lost a shovel, or an engineer who hasn't carried out an order the way he should have. Didn't both these chiefs constitute the cream of society in remote settlements? Were they not the serf holders of taiga industry? And didn't their wives call on one another? If, nonetheless, there is incessant tuchta in padded worksheets, if there is a constant attestation to trenches dug and filled which never yawned in the earth's surface, repair of heating systems or lathes which were never out of order, replacement of perfectly sturdy posts which will still be standing there for another 10 years, then this is done not at the instigation of the camp chiefs, who are quite calm and confident that the money will flow to the camp one way or another anyway, but by Zeks themselves, brigadiers, norm-setters, foremen, because all state work norms are the same. They are calculated not for real life on this earth, but for some kind of unearthly ideal on the moon. A human being dedicated, self-sacrificing, healthy, well-nourished, and energetic is incapable of fulfilling those norms. And so what are you going to get out of a fagged-out, weak, hungry, and downtrodden convict? The state system of setting work norms prescribes an output impossible on this planet, and in this sense resembles socialist realism and belles lettres. But if the unsold books are easily shredded later, it is more complicated to cover up industrial tuchta. However, it is not impossible. In their constant tail-chasing haste, the director and the construction superintendent have, let's say, overlooked or missed noticing, failed to discover the tuchta, and the free foremen were either illiterate or drunk, or else well disposed to the zeks, with the expectation, of course, that in a difficult moment the zek brigadier would help them out. And by then the percentage bonus had been eaten up, and you couldn't pull the bread back out of the belly. Accountants' inspections and audits are notorious for their clumsiness. They turn up tuchta after a delay of months or years, when the money paid out for the work has long since flitted away, and all that can still be done is to bring charges against one of the free employees, or else smudge it up and write it off. 3 pillars on which the archipelago is propped were set there by the leadership: the differentiated ration pot, the work brigade, and the 2 sets of bosses. And the 4th and main pillar was tuchta, and it was put there by the archipelago natives and by life itself. For tuchta, it is essential to have energetic, enterprising brigadiers, but production chiefs from among the zeks are even more necessary. No few of them were foremen, norm-setters, planners, economists, because you just wouldn't drag free people off to those distant places. Some zeks in those positions forgot who they were, became more cruel than free workers, trampled on their brother prisoners, and made their way over dead bodies to their own release ahead of term. Others, on the contrary, retained a distinct consciousness of their motherland, the archipelago, and introduced reasonable moderation in the management of production and a reasonable share of tuchta in their accounting. There was a risk for them in this, not the risk of getting a new term, because the terms were already piled high anyway, and their code articles were harsh, but the risk of losing their position, angering the chiefs, landing in a bad prisoner transport, and thus perishing silently. And therefore their staunchness and intelligence were all the more glorious in that they helped their brothers to survive. Vasily Grigorievich Vlasov, for example, whose acquaintance we have already made in connection with the Kadi trial, was that kind of person. Throughout his whole long sentence, he served 19 years without any interruption, he retained that same stubborn self-assurance which characterized his conduct during the trial, and with which he had mocked Kalinin and the commutation of his death sentence. Through all these years, when he was dried up from starvation and breaking his back on general work, he perceived himself not as a scapegoat, but as a genuine political prisoner, and even as a revolutionary, as he used to describe himself in heart-to-heart conversations. And when, thanks to his naturally sharp administrative grasp, which in his case substituted for his incomplete schooling in economics, he held jobs as a trustee in production posts, Vlasov sought not only to postpone his own death, but also the chance to patch up the whole cart, so it was easier for the rest of the fellows to pull it along. In the 40s, on one of the Ust-Vim logging camp sites, and Ust-Vim-Lag was distinct from the general pattern in that it had only one unified set of bosses. The camp itself ran its logging, did its own auditing, and was responsible for plan fulfillment to the Ministry of the Timber Industry. Vlasov simultaneously combined the duties of norm-setter and planner. He was the head of the whole thing there, and in winter, in order to provide support for the sloggers out logging, he credited their brigades with fictitious cubic yards of wood cut. One of the winters was particularly severe, and working just as hard as they could, the zeks fulfilled the work norms by only 60%, but received rations for having fulfilled 125% of norm. And with the help of these beefed-up rations, they managed to last out the winter without halting work even one day. However, shipments of the felled, on paper, timber were far behind schedule, and the camp chief heard some evil rumors. In March he sent a commission of 4 men into the woods, and they turned up a shortage of 10,500 cubic yards of timber. The enraged chief summoned Vlasov, who heard him out, and then said to him, "Give 'em, chief, 5 days in the brig. They're all sluts. They were too lazy to get out into the woods because the snow there is still deep. Set up a new commission with me as the chairman." And thereupon, with his own sensible troika, Vlasov, without leaving his office, drew up an official document and found all the missing timber. The chief was quieted down for the time being, but in May there was more trouble. They were still shipping out too little timber, and the higher-ups kept asking questions. So the chief called in Vlasov again. Vlasov was a short fellow, but he always retained his vigorous, rooster-like bearing, and this time he didn't even pretend. The timber just didn't exist. "So how could you have drawn up a false document, blankety blank blank blank?" Vlasov replied, "Do you think it would have been better for you to go to jail yourself? After all, 10,500 cubic yards is a full 10-ruble bill for a free employee, and even for a Chekist, it's a 5. The chief cursed him out, but by this time it was too late to punish Vlasov. The whole thing depended on him. "Well, what's to be done now?" Vlasov answered, "Just wait till the roads have completely dissolved in mud." And the time came when the winter roads had all dissolved completely, and the summer logging trails were still impassable too. And at this point, Vlasov brought the chief a detailed and watertight report for his signature, to be sent on to the administration higher up. In it, he proved that because of the highly successful timber-felling operations of the past winter, it had been quite impossible to move 10,500 cubic yards out of the forests on the sledge trails. Neither could this timber be hauled out through the swampy forests. Next, he gave estimates for the cost of a corduroy road to get the timber out, and he proved that the haulage would cost more than the timber was worth. So that, in a year's time, because the logs were going to be lying there in the swamp for a whole summer and autumn, they would be unsuitable for lumber, and acceptable to any possible customer only for firewood. And the administration agreed with these literate conclusions, which they were not ashamed to show any other commission, and therefore the whole 10,500 cubic yards of timber were written off. And so it was that the trees were felled and eaten up and written off, and stood once again erect and proud in their green coniferous garb. And in fact the state paid very reasonably for these dead cubic yards, a few hundred extra loaves of black, gluey, watery bread. The thousands of trees and the hundreds of lives which were saved were of no account on the profit and loss sheet, because this kind of wealth was never counted in the archipelago. In all probability, Vlasov was not the only one who had been so perspicacious as to play the swindler, because from 1947 on they introduced a new system in all logging operations, complex work gangs and complex work brigades. And now the lumberjacks were combined with the teamsters in one work gang, and the brigade was only credited with timber hauled out to the slide on the river bank to the site of the spring log drive. And so what happened then? Did this burst the balloon of the Tuchta? Hardly. It even flourished. It expanded out of necessity, and the mass of workers nourished on it grew larger and larger. For those among our readers who are not bored with this, let's go into it more deeply. 1. The Zeks were not permitted to accompany the logs farther than the slide on the river bank. Who would convoy them down the river? Vigilance. Therefore, an expediter of the log rafting office, which was staffed with free lumberjacks, accepted the timber from the camp dispatcher, for all the brigades, at the river. Well, now, he, of course, was strict in his receipts. Not at all. The camp dispatcher would inflate the figures as much as he had to on behalf of the logging brigades, and the expediter of the log rafting office was agreeable to the whole deal. 2. And here is why. The log rafting office also had the problem of feeding its own free workers, and their work norms were equally impossible. And the log rafting office listed all of this non-existent fictitious timber as having been rafted downriver. 3. At the general landing and sorting point downriver, where the timber was collected from all the logging sectors, there was a bourse, which was a landing area for logs. Here again, Zeks were doing the work, attached to that self-same Ust-Vimlag. The 52 islands of Ust-Vimlag were scattered over a territory 96 miles square. Now that is what our archipelago is like. The dispatcher of the log rafting office was quite at ease. The camp expediter would now accept back all the tukhta, in the second place so as not to betray his own camp, which had previously delivered it to the slide, and in the first place so as to feed its own prisoners working at the landing point with that same fictitious timber. They, too, had their own fantastic work norms, and they needed their crust, too. At this point, however, the camp expediter had to toil a bit for the sake of society. He not only had to accept the timber by total volume, but also list it, existing and fictitious, by diameters and lengths in a complete schedule. Now here was a benefactor for you. Vlasov worked at this job, too. 4. After the bourse came the sawmill, which processed the logs into cut lumber. Once more, the workers were Zeks. The brigades were given rations on the basis of their volume of raw timber processed, and the extra fictitious timber was just exactly what they needed in order to increase their own percentage output. 5. Next came the lumber yard for the completed product, which was required, according to state norms, to have 65% of the amount of raw timber received by the sawmill. Thus it was that 65% of the fictitious timber moved invisibly into the lumber yard, and the mythical lumber was likewise inventoried by sorts, wavy-edged slab, construction lumber, by thickness of board, edged, unedged. The lumber yard workers, too, got their food out of that same fictitious timber. But what happened then? The fictitious lumber was shut up in the lumber yard, where it was guarded by the camp guard, and there could not be any more uncontrolled losses. And who at this point was going to answer for the tukhta, and how? At this point, another great principle of the archipelago came to the aid of the principle of tukhta. This was the principle of rubber, in other words, stretching things out with interminable delays. Once on the books, the fictitious production kept being carried over from one year to another. Whenever there was inventory taking in this wild archipelago backwards, all those engaged in it were, after all, friends, and all understood. You wouldn't go around moving every board in the place just for the sake of the audit. Unfortunately, a certain percentage of fictitious lumber could spoil from being kept too long, and could be written off. And they would fire one manager of the lumber yard, and then another, and put them to work as work norm setters. And how many people had been fed in the meanwhile? Here is what they tried to do, too. When they loaded lumber into railroad cars for shipment to buyers, there was no customer expediter up there, and the railroad cars would subsequently be scattered all over the country on the basis of bills of lading. They tried similarly to ship the fictitious lumber as well, in other words, to inflate the amount shipped, and this fed the stevedore brigades, let's note. The railroad put a seal on the car. It couldn't care less. After a certain length of time, somewhere in Armavir or Krivoy Rog, they would break the seal on the car and open it up and document the amount actually received. If the underweight was moderate, then all these differences in volume would be collected in some schedule or other, and it would be up to the State Planning Commission to account for them. If the underweight was outrageous, the recipient would send a claim to Ust-Vimlag, but these claims moved in a flood of millions of other papers and were stapled in a file somewhere, and in time simply went out like a light. After all, they simply could not stand up against people's pressure to live. And no one was going to send the carload of lumber back from Armavir. You took what you got. There was no timber in the south. Now let us note the fact that the state and the Ministry of the Timber Industry made serious use in their economic reports of these fictitiously inflated figures for the production of cut and processed timber. They were useful to the ministry, too. And this is how tukhta, like many of the archipelago's problems, could not be kept confined to it, but acquired a nationwide significance. But probably the most surprising thing was this. It would seem that there should have been a shortage of timber because of the fictitious inflation of quantities at every stage of its movement. However, the fact was that the expediter at the landing Bourse managed to add so much fictitious timber to deliveries in the course of the summer season that by fall the timber rafting office had surpluses waiting in the water. They had not been touched, and they must not be left in the river for the winter, because if they were, it would be necessary in the spring to call in a plane to bomb them loose. And therefore this surplus timber, which no one needed, was allowed in late autumn to float downstream into the White Sea. Is that miraculous, strange, and wonderful? But it didn't just happen in one place. At the lumber yards in Untitled there was always surplus lumber left over, which hadn't been loaded into railroad cars, and which was no longer listed as belonging to anyone anywhere. And for years after some lumber yard had been totally shut down, people would subsequently journey to it from nearby camps for ownerless dry firewood, and burn in their stoves the stripped pit props which had taken so much suffering to produce. And all this was a matter of attempting to survive, not to enrich oneself, and certainly not to plunder the state. The state cannot be so excessively fierce and force its subjects into deceit. And here is what the prisoners used to say. Without Tukta and Amonau, never could we have built the canal. So all that is what the archipelago stands on. Chapter 6. They've brought the fascists. They've brought the fascists! They've brought the fascists! The young Zek lads and girls shouted excitedly, running through the camp when our 2 trucks, each loaded with 30 fascists, entered the perimeter of the small rectangle of the Novaya Jerusalem camp. We had just experienced one of the supreme hours of our life, the 1 hour's drive from Moscow's Krasnaya Presnya prison, what is called a short-distance prisoner transport. Though we had spent the ride with our knees hunched up in the rear of the trucks, nonetheless all the air, the speed, the colors were ours. Oh, forgotten brightness of the world! The streetcars were red, the trolleybuses sky blue, the crowd in white and many-colored. Do they themselves see these colors as they crowd onto the buses? And on top of this today, for some reason, all the buildings and the lampposts were decorated with banners and streamers, some sort of unexpected holiday, August the 14th, coinciding with the holiday of our liberation from prison. On this day, the capitulation of Japan had been announced, ending the 7-day war. On the Volokolamsk highway, a whirlwind of scents of new-mown hay and of the early evening freshness of the meadows swirled around our shaven heads. This meadow breeze, who could breathe it in more greedily than prisoners? Real, genuine green blinded our eyes, grown used to grey and more grey. I turned up on the transport with Gamarov and Ingal, and we sat next to each other, and it seemed to us as if we were going to a gay dacha, a country house. The end of such a bewitching journey could not be something dismal. And then we jumped from the trucks, stretched our numbed legs and backs, and looked around. We liked the compound of Novaya Jerusalem. It was even attractive. It was surrounded not by a solid fence, but merely by an interwoven barbed wire fence. And in every direction were visible the hilly, lively village and dasha countryside of the Svenigorod land. It was as if we were part of that gay milieu. We could see the earth just like those who came here to rest and enjoy themselves, and we could even see it on a larger, deeper scale, for our eyes had grown used to flat walls, flat sleeping boards, and shallow cells. And to us it seemed even more succulent. The greenery, which had faded by mid-August, blinded us, and perhaps, too, it seemed to have so much succulence because the sun was setting. "So you are the fascists? Are all of you fascists?" the approaching Zeks asked us hopefully. And having confirmed that, yes, we were the fascists, they immediately scurried off and left the scene. There was nothing else about us that interested them. We already knew, of course, that the Fascists was a nickname for the 58s, introduced by the sharp-eyed thieves, and very much approved by the chiefs. Previously, they had well named the 58s KRs, but then all that had grown stale, and a catchy label was needed. After our swift trip in the fresh air, here it seemed warmer, and because of that cozier. We were still looking around the tiny compound with its 2-story building of brick for men, and the women's building, which was wooden with an attic story, and some peasant-style tumble-down sheds for auxiliary services. And then at the long black shadows which lay everywhere in the fields, cast by the trees and the buildings, and at the high chimney of the brickyard, and at the already flaming windows of its 2 buildings. Well, things aren't so bad here, it seems. We spoke to one another, trying to convince each other and ourselves. One young fellow with that sharply alert and hostile expression, which we had already begun to notice in others, lingered near us longer than the rest, inspecting the Fascists with interest. His well-worn black cap sat crookedly forward on his forehead. He kept his hands in his pockets, and he stood there just like that, listening to our chatter. Not bad. His chest shook. Twisting his lips, he looked us over contemptuously once again and hurled out, "Starvation station! You'll kick the bucket!" And spitting under our feet, he went out. He found it unbearable to listen any longer to such idiots. Our hearts fell. The first night in camp, you are already being borne along a slippery slide, down, and somewhere there must be still a saving, protruding ledge, which you have to catch hold of, but you don't know where it is. Everything that was worst in your entire upbringing has come alive inside you. Everything suspicious, gloomy, grasping, cruel, instilled there by hungry cues, by the blatant injustice of the strong. This worst in you has been even more aroused, even more stirred up inside you, by the preceding rumors about the camps. Just don't get put on general work. The wolfish camp world. Here they tear you to pieces alive. Here they stomp on he who has stumbled. Just don't go on general work. But how can you avoid it? Which way is one to flee? One has to give something. One has to give to someone. But what in particular, and to whom, and how is it done? Not an hour has gone by, and a fellow aboard our same transport comes up with a restrained smile. He has been named a construction engineer in the camp compound. And one more, he has been given permission to open a barber shop for the free workers at the factory. And yet another, he ran into an old acquaintance, and he is going to go to work in the planning section. Your heart winces. All this is skin off your back. They will survive in the offices and the barber shops, and you will perish. Perish. The compound, 200 paces from barbed wire to barbed wire, and you can't go close to it either. Yes, all around you the Svenigorod hills will gleam green, but in here is a starvation mess hall, and a stone dungeon for a penalty isolator, and a miserable lean-to over a burner for individual cooking, a rotten shed of a bath, a grey booth of a tumble-down latrine with rotting seats, and nowhere to hide from it. This was it. Perhaps this little island would be the last piece of earth in your life which your feet were destined to tromp on. In all the rooms, bare multiple bunks, vagonki, were installed. The multiple bunk was the invention of the archipelago, an adaptation for the sleep of the natives never encountered anywhere else in the world. 2 stories of 4 wooden panels on 2 cross-shaped supports, placed at the head and at the feet. When one sleeper stirred, 3 others rocked. They did not issue mattresses in this camp, nor sacks to stuff with straw. The words bed linen were unknown to the natives of the Novi Jerusalem island. No sheets or pillowcases existed here, and they did not issue or launder underwear. You had what you wore, and you had to look after it yourself. And the manager of camp property had never heard the word pillow. The only pillows were those you owned, and were had only by women and thieves. In the evening, when you lay down on the naked panel, you could take off your shoes, but take into consideration that your shoes would be swiped. Better sleep with shoes on. Better not scatter your clothes about either. They'd swipe them, too. On going out to work in the morning, you must not leave anything in the barracks. Whatever the thieves did not bother to take, the jailers would, announcing, "It's forbidden." In the morning you would go out to work just as nomads depart from a campsite, leaving it even cleaner. You would leave neither the ashes from your bonfires nor the bones of devoured animals. The room would be empty, totally bare, and you could even turn it over for others to occupy. And your own sleeping panel would have nothing to distinguish it from all the others, bare, greasy, polished by bodies. But you couldn't cart anything off to work with you either. You would gather up your chattels in the morning, stand in line at the storeroom for personal belongings, and hide them in a bag or a suitcase.
This book is continued at this point, on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2, Section 1, continued. Cassette 5, Side 2.
But you couldn't cart anything off to work with you either. You would gather up your chattels in the morning, stand in line at the storeroom for personal belongings, and hide them in a bag or a suitcase. You'd return from work and stand in line again at the storeroom, and take with you what you could foresee you would want overnight.
Better not make a mistake, because you'd not get to the storeroom a second time.
And thus, for 10 years. Hold your head high. The morning shift returned to camp sometime after 2. They washed up, had lunch, stood in line at the storeroom, and the bell rang for roll call. Everyone in the camp formed up in rows, and an illiterate jailer with a plywood board went around, slobbering on his pencil, wrinkling up his forehead wisely, and whispering over and over. He recounted the line-up several times. He went over all the buildings several times, leaving the line-up standing there. Either he was wrong in his arithmetic, or he was confused as to how many were ill, and how many were imprisoned in the Shizo under orders not to be allowed out. This senseless expenditure of time kept dragging on for a long while, an hour, sometimes an hour and a half. And those to whom time was precious, even though this need is not very developed in our people, and not at all among Zeks, those who even in camp wanted to accomplish something, felt themselves particularly helpless and humiliated. It was forbidden to read in line-up. My boys, Gamarov and Ingal, stood with closed eyes, composing either verses or prose or letters. But you were not permitted to stand like that in line-up because it looked as though you were sleeping, and this was an insult to the roll call. And furthermore, your ears were not closed, and the mother oaths and the stupid jokes and the dismal conversations all kept swarming in. The year was 1945, and Norbert Wiener would soon formulate cybernetics. The atom had already been split, and here pale-faced intellectuals were standing in a row, waiting to hear the command, "Stand still, don't turn," while the stupid red-mug idiot lazily whispered his total. The roll call was completed, and now at 5:30 one could go and lie down and take a nap, because the night before had been short and the coming night might be even shorter. However, dinner would be in an hour. The time was all cut up into bits. The camp administration was so lazy and so untalented, it did not even have the desire and initiative to separate the workers on the 3 different shifts into different rooms. From 7 to 8 after dinner, the first shift could have begun to rest, but those who were fed and fresh wanted no part of peace, and the thieves on their feather comforters were just beginning their card games, their yelling, and their little dramatic numbers. One thief, of an Azerbaijanian type, creeping up in an exaggerated way, made the rounds of the room by jumping from bunk to bunk on the upper panels, and roared out at the sloggers, "That's how Napoleon went to Moscow for tobacco." Having got himself tobacco, he returned by the same route, stepping on and across people and shouting, "That's how Napoleon fled to Paris." Every escapade of the thieves was so astonishing and unusual that we could only gape at them. From 9 in the evening, the night shift was shaking the bunks, tramping about, making preparations to leave and taking their things off to the storeroom. They were marched out at 10 p.m. At last it seemed we could sleep. But after 10 the day shift returned, and now they were the ones tramping heavily about, shaking the bunks, washing up, going for things in the storeroom, and getting dinner. Only from perhaps 11:30 on did the exhausted camp sleep. But at 4:15, the ring of singing metal was wafted over our small camp and across the sleepy collective farm around us, where the old folks still remember very well the chimes of the Easter church bells. Perhaps our silver-voiced camp bell came from the monastery also, and had grown used, while there, to getting the monks up for prayer and work at the sound of the first cock-crow. "Get up, first shift!" the jailer shouted into each room, head dizzy from insufficient sleep, eyes still not unglued, no chance to wash. And you don't have to get dressed, that's how you slept. So straight off to the mess hall. You enter, still staggering with sleep. Everyone pushes ahead and is absolutely certain of what he wants. Some rush for their bread ration, others for gruel. You were the only one wandering about like a lunatic beneath the dim lamps, unable in the steam of the gruel to see where to find either bread or gruel. Finally you received 19¼ ounces of bread, fit for a feast, and an earthenware bowl with something hot and black. This is black cabbage soup, made from nettles. The black shreds of the boiled leaves lie in the blackish, empty water. There is no fish, meat, nor fat, not even salt. In cooking, the nettles soak up all the salt thrown in, and therefore they don't put any in. If tobacco is camp gold, then salt is camp silver, and the cooks save it up. Unsalted nettle soup is a repulsive poison. You are hungry, but you can't pour it into yourself. Lift up your eyes, not to the heavens, but to the ceiling. Your eyes have already grown accustomed to the dim lamps, and you can now make out along the wall the long slogan written on wallpaper in the favorite red letters, "Whoever does not work does not eat." And goose pimples run up and down your chest. Oh, wise men from the cultural and educational section, how satisfied you were when you sought out that great evangelical and communist slogan for the camp mess hall. But in the Gospel of St. Luke it says, "The laborer is worthy of his hire." And in the book of Deuteronomy it says, "Thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn." And what you have is an exclamation point. Thank you on behalf of the ox treading out the corn. And henceforth I will understand that you are not at all squeezing my emaciated neck because of shortages, that you are choking me not simply out of greed, but out of the bright principle of the onrushing society, except that I do not see in camp those who work eating, and I do not see in camp those who don't work starving. Day is breaking. The pre-dawn August heavens grow pale. Only the brightest of the stars are still visible in the sky. To the southeast, above the brickyard, where we will now be taken, are Procyon and Sirius, the alpha stars of Canis Minor and Canis Major. Everything has abandoned us along with the jailers, even the heavens. The dogs in the heavens, like those on earth, are on the leashes of guards. The dogs bark madly, leap ahead, try to get at us. They are gloriously trained on human meat. The first day in camp. I do not wish even my worst enemy that day. The folds of the brain are all mixed up because of the impossibility of absorbing the entire scope of the cruelty. How will it be? What will happen to me? My head keeps grinding it over and over, and the newcomers are all given the most meaningless work possible just to keep them busy while things are sorted out. An endless day. You carry hand barrows, or you push wheelbarrows along, and with each wheelbarrow load the day grows shorter by 5 or 10 minutes only, and your mind remains free solely in order to keep turning over and over. How will it be? How will it be? We see the absurdity of rolling this waste along. We try to chat between wheelbarrows. It seems as if we have already become exhausted from those very first wheelbarrow loads. We have already given them our strength, And how are we going to go on pushing them for 8 years? We try to talk about something in which we can feel our strength and our individuality. Ingal describes the funeral of Tinyanov, whose pupil he considers himself. And we argue about historical novels. Ought anyone dare write them? After all, an historical novel is a novel about things the author never saw. Burdened by distance and the maturity of his own era, the author can try as much as he pleases to convince himself that he has come to comprehend, but after all the same, he is unable to live it. And does this mean that an historical novel is first of all fantasy? At this point they begin to call into the office the Zeks from the new prisoner transport, several at a time, for their assignments, and all of us left our wheelbarrows. The previous day, Ingal had managed to get to know somebody, and as a result he, a literary person, was assigned to the factory bookkeeping office, even though he got figures ridiculously mixed up, and in all his born days had never done calculations on an abacus. Gamarov was incapable of begging and grabbing off a spot, even to save his life. He was made an unskilled labourer. He came over, lay down on the grass, and during this last little hour in which he didn't have to be an unskilled labourer, he told me about the persecuted poet Pavel Vasilyev, of whom I had never heard a word. When had these boys managed to read and learn so much? I bit on a stalk of grass and wavered. Which of my cards should I play? Mathematics, or my experience as an officer? I was unable to withdraw proudly like Boris. Once I had been brought up with other ideals, but from the 30s, cruel life had rubbed us in only one direction, to go after and get. And it happened quite naturally that when I crossed the threshold of the brickyard director's office, I had tucked the stomach fold in my field shirt beneath my broad officer's belt along the sides, and I had intentionally dressed up for this day, too, disregarding the fact that I was to wheel a wheelbarrow. My high collar was severely buttoned up. "An officer?" the director immediately surmised. "Yes, sir." "Do you have experience working with people?" Once more, with people, please note. "I do." "What did you command?" "An artillery battalion." I lied on the wing. A battery seemed too small to me. He looked at me with both trust and doubt. "And will you manage here? It's hard here." "I think I'll manage," I replied. After all, I didn't understand myself what a noose I was sticking my neck into. The main thing was to go after and get. He squinted a bit and thought. He was calculating how ready I was to remake myself into a dog and whether my jaw was firm. "All right, you will be a shift foreman in the clay pit." And one other former officer, Nikolai Akimov, was also named a foreman in the clay pit. He and I went out of the office feeling kinship, gladness. We could not have understood then, even had we been told, that we had chosen the standard, for army man, servile beginning of a sentence. It was clear from Akimov's unintellectual and unassuming face that he was an open lad and a good soldier. "What's the director scaring us with? Does he think we can't cope with 20 men? There's no minefield, and no one is bombing us. What can't we cope with?" We wanted to recreate inside ourselves our former front-line self-assurance. We were pups, and we did not understand to what extent the archipelago was unlike the front, to what degree its war of siege was more difficult than our war of explosives. In the army, even a fool and a nonentity can command, and in fact the higher the post he occupies, the greater will be his success. While a squad commander has to have a quick grasp of things, inexhaustible energy and courage, and understanding of the soldier's heart, it is quite enough for one marshal or another to be peevish, to curse, and to be able to sign his name. Everything else will be done for him, and the plan of operations will be brought him by the operations section of his staff, some bright officer with an unknown name. The soldiers will execute the orders, not because they are convinced of their correctness, for often it is precisely the reverse, but because orders come from top to bottom through the hierarchy, and they are the orders of a machine, and whoever does not carry them out will have his head cut off. But in the archipelago it is not at all like that for the Zek who has been appointed to command other Zeks, The whole golden shoulder-board hierarchy is not towering behind your back, and not at all supporting your orders. It will betray you and toss you out as soon as you are unable to carry out those orders with your own strength, your own skill. And the skill here is either your fist, or pitiless destruction through starvation, or such a profound knowledge of the archipelago that your order also appears to each prisoner as his own salvation. A greenish Arctic moisture has to replace the warm blood inside you. Only then can you command Zex. And right then, during those very days, they started to bring from the Shitso, the penalty isolator, to the clay pit, as the heaviest work of all, a penalty brigade, a group of thieves who just a bit earlier had almost cut the throat of the camp chief. They had not wanted to cut his throat because they were not such fools as that, but to frighten him so he would send them back to Krasnaya Presnya. They recognized Novi Jerusalem as a deadly place where you'd never get enough to eat. They were brought in at the end of my shift. They lay down in the clay pit in a sheltered spot, bared their short, thick arms and legs, their fat, tattooed stomachs and chests, and lay there sunning themselves, content to be out of the wet cellar of the Shitso. I went up to them in my military attire, and precisely, properly proposed that they set to work. The sun put them in a benign mood, and therefore they only laughed and sent me to the well-known mother. I was enraged and confused, and departed empty-handed. In the army I would have begun with the order, "Stand up." But here it was quite clear that if any one of them did stand up, it would be solely to stick a knife in my ribs. And while I was cudgelling my brains over what to do, after all, the rest of the clay pit was watching and might also quit work, my shift came to an end. Only thanks to this circumstance am I here today to write this study of the archipelago. I was replaced by Akimov. The thieves continued to lie there, sunning themselves. He gave them one order. The second time he shouted a command at them, maybe even "stand up." And the third time he threatened them with the camp chief, and they chased him, and in a low spot in the clay pit knocked him down and smashed him in the kidneys with a crowbar. He was taken directly from the factory to the provincial prison hospital, and this brought his career as a commander to an end, and maybe his prison sentence, and maybe his life. In all probability, the director had appointed us as dummies to be beaten up by these thieves. My own short career at the clay pit lasted several days longer than Akimov's, but brought me not the satisfaction I had expected, only a constant spiritual depression. At 6 a.m. I entered the working compound more deeply despondent than if I had been going there to dig the clay myself. I wandered around the clay pit like one quite lost, hating both it and my own role in it. From the wet pressing mill to the clay pit there was a trolley track. At the spot where the level area ended and its rails dipped into the workings, a windlass stood on a platform. This motor-driven windlass was one of the few miracles of mechanization in the whole brickyard. Along the entire line from clay pit to windlass and from the windlass to the pressing mill, the sloggers had to push the cars loaded with clay. Only on the rise out of the clay pit were the cars dragged up by the windlass. The clay pit occupied a distant corner of the brickyard compound, and it was a surface ploughed up by cave-ins, the cave-ins branching off in all directions like ravines, leaving between them untouched prominences. The clay lay right up to the surface, and the stratum was not thin. One could probably have mined it deep down, or else across its whole width continuously, but no one knew how it should be done, and no one made a plan for mining it, and it all was managed by the brigadier of the morning shift, Barinov, a cocky young Muscovite, a non-political offender with a pretty face. Barinov worked the clay pit simply where it was most convenient. He excavated where the most clay could be dug for the least work. He never went too deep, so the cars wouldn't have to be pushed up too steep a slope. Properly speaking, Barinov was in charge of all 18 to 20 men who worked during my shift in the clay pit. He was the only genuine boss of shift. He knew the lads, he fed them. In other words, got for them big rations, and each day wisely decided himself how many cars of clay were to be delivered, so that there would be neither too few nor too many. I liked Barinov, and if I had been somewhere in prison with him as a bunk neighbor, we would have got along very gaily, and we could have got along right here, too. I should have gone to him and had a big laugh with him over the fact that the director had appointed me to the position of intermediate watchdog, while I understood nothing. But my officer's training did not permit this, and I tried to maintain a severe bearing with him and to get him to knuckle under, though not only I, and not only he, but the entire brigade, could see that I was as much of a useless meddler as a district party instructor during crop sowing. It made Barinov angry that they had installed a stuffed shirt over him, and more than once he mocked me cleverly in front of the brigade. In the case of anything I considered necessary to do, he immediately proved to me that it was impossible. On the other hand, loudly shouting, "Foreman! Foreman!" he would on occasion summon me to various corners of the clay pit and ask me for instructions, how to take up the old trolley tracks and lay new ones again, how a wheel that had jumped off the axle should be put back again, or what to do about the allegedly non-functioning windlass, or where the shovel should be taken to be sharpened. Already weakening from day to day in my impulse to command, in the face of his ridicule, I was by then quite happy if he simply ordered the fellows to dig that morning. He didn't always do it, and did not annoy me with his vexatious questions. Thereupon, I quietly kept out of the way and hid from my subordinates and my chiefs behind the high piles of earth that had been carted away, set myself down on the ground and sat stock still with sinking heart. My spirit was numb from my first few days in camp. Oh, this was not prison. Prison has wings. Prison is a treasure house of thought. It was gay and easy to starve and argue in prison. And just try that here, 10 years of starvation, work, and silence. Just try it. The iron caterpillar track was already dragging me to the grinder. I was helpless. I didn't know how, but I wanted to slip off to one side, to catch my breath, to come to myself, to lift my head and to see. Over there, beyond the barbed wire, across a vale, was a knoll. On it was a little village, 10 houses. The rising sun illuminated it with its peaceful rays. So close to us, and the very opposite of a camp. For that matter, it too was a camp, but one forgets that. For a long time there was no motion at all there, but then a woman walked by with a pail, and a tiny child ran across the weeds in the street. A cock crowed, and a cow mooed. And there, in the clay pit, we could hear everything perfectly. And a mongrel barked. What a lovely voice that was, too. It was not a convoy dog. When there are discussions about universal disarmament, I am always quite concerned. After all, no one has included guard dogs in the lists of forbidden weapons, and yet they make life more insufferable for human beings than do rockets. And from every sound there, and from the very immobility itself, a holy peace flooded into my soul. And I know for certain that if they should say to me at that very moment, "That's your freedom, just live in that village until your death, renounce cities and the vanities of this world, your passing fancies, your convictions, the truth, renounce it all and live in that village, but not as a collective farmer. Look at the sun every morning and hearken to the roosters. Are you willing?" Oh, not only willing, but, good Lord, please send me a life like that. I felt that I would be unable to last out in camp. On the other side of the brickyard, invisible to me at the moment, a passenger train roared by on the Rzhev line. In the clay pit they shouted, "The trustees' train!" Every train was familiar. They kept time by them. The trustees' train passed by at 9:15, and at 9 o'clock, separately, not at shift-changing time, they would conduct the trustees from the camp to the brickyard, the office employees and those in positions of responsibility. The favorite train was at 1:30, the provider, after which we soon went to line up and to lunch. My Zek supervisor, Olga Petrovna Matronina, was brought to work along with the trustees, and sometimes, if her heart was anxious about the work, even earlier by a special convoy. I sighed, came out of my hiding place, and went along the clay pit trolley track to the wet pressing factory to report. The entire brickyard consisted of 2 plants, for wet pressing and dry pressing. Our clay pit worked only for the wet pressing plant, and the chief of the wet pressing was Matronina, an engineer specialist in silicates. What kind of an engineer she was, I do not know, but she was fussy and stubborn. She was one of those unshakable loyalists, an orthodox communist, of whom I had already encountered a few in the cells, there were not many of them in general, on whose mountain peak, however, I myself could not cling. On the basis of the letter section, CHS, as a member of the family of one shot, she had received 8 years from an OSO, and right now she was serving out her last months. True, they had not released any politicals throughout the war, and she too would be held until the notorious special decree. But even that did not cast any shadow on her state of mind. She served the party, and it was unimportant whether in freedom or in camp. She was from a reserve for rare animals. In camp she tied a red scarf around her head, and only a red scarf, even though she was already over 40. Not one camp girl wore a scarf like that in the brickyard, and not one free Komsomol girl either. She bore no grudge for her husband's execution, nor for her own 8 years of imprisonment. All these injustices had been caused, in her opinion, by individual Yagoda or Zhezhov henchmen, and under Comrade Beria the only arrests being made were just. Seeing me in the uniform of a Soviet officer, she said at our first meeting, "Those who arrested me can now see the proofs of my orthodoxy."
Not long before, she had written a letter to Kalinin, and she quoted from it to all who wished or were forced to listen. "My long sentence has not broken my will in the struggle for the Soviet government, for Soviet industry."
Meanwhile, when Akimov had come and reported to her that the thieves refused to obey him, she herself did not go to explain to this socially friendly element that their conduct was harming industry, but she pulled him up short. "You have to compel them. That's why you were appointed." Akimov was beaten up, and she made no effort to struggle further, but merely wrote the camp, "Don't send us that contingent any more." She also accepted very calmly the fact that in her factory young girls worked 8 hours straight as automatic machines. They were confined uninterruptedly for the whole 8-hour period to monotonous motions at the conveyor belt. She said, "There is nothing to be done. There are more important sectors than that for mechanization." The day before, Saturday, there had been a rumor going the rounds that they would again not give us our Sunday off, and that's exactly what happened. The young girls at the automatic machines clustered around her and said to her bitterly, "Olga Petrovna, are they really going to take our Sunday away from us again? After all, this is the 3rd in a row. The war's over." Wearing her red scarf, she indignantly tossed her dry, dark profile, which wasn't a woman's, nor a man's either. "Girls, what right have we to a Sunday? The construction project in Moscow is being held up because there are no bricks." In other words, of course, she didn't know anything about any particular construction project to which our bricks were being sent. But in her mind's eye she could see that big, generalized construction project, and here were these young girls so vile as to want to wash their things. I was necessary to Matronina in order to double the number of cars of clay in one shift. She took no account of the strength of the sloggers, the condition of the cars, or the capacity of the pressing plant, but merely demanded that it be doubled. And how could an outsider unacquainted with the setup double the number of carloads except with his fist? I did not double the output, and by and large the output did not change by 1 carload under me, and Matronina, merciless, scolded me in Barinov's presence and that of the workers, without being able to get through her woman's head that which the least sergeant knows, that one must not dress down even a corporal in the presence of a private. And then, on one occasion, admitting my total defeat in the clay pit, and therefore my incapacity to direct, I went to Matronina, and as gently as I could asked her, "Olga Petrovna, I am a good mathematician, I do figures quickly, I have heard that you need an accountant in the plant. Take me." "An accountant?" she raged, and her cruel face grew even darker, and the ends of her red scarf wound about the back of her head. "I'll put any wisp of a girl to work as an accountant, but what we need are commanders of production. How many loads are you short for your shift? Be off with you." And, like a new Pallas Athena, with outstretched arms, she sent me back to the clay pit. And a day later the position of foreman of the clay pit was abolished, and I was fired, not just straightforwardly, but vengefully. Matronina summoned Barinov and gave him his orders. "Put him to work with a crowbar, and don't take your eyes off him. Make him load 6 cars a shift. Make him sweat." And right then, in my officer's uniform, in which I took so much pride, I went forth to dig clay. Barinov was overjoyed. He had foreseen my fall. If I had better understood the secret, alert connection between all camp events, I could have guessed at my fate the day before. In the Novi Jerusalem mess hall there was a separate serving window for the ITRs, the engineering and technical workers, from which the engineers, bookkeepers, and shoemakers received their meals. After my appointment as foreman of the clay pit, catching on to the camp grasp of things, I had approached this window and demanded my meal. The cooks dragged their feet about it, saying that I wasn't on the list of ITRs, but nonetheless they did each time issue me my meal, and even without protesting after a while, so that I myself came to believe that I was on their list. As I thought it over later, I was, for the kitchen, still a question mark. Hardly had I arrived than I acted big. I had borne myself proudly and gone about in military uniform. Such a person might very easily in a week become a senior work assigner, or the senior camp bookkeeper, or a doctor. In camp, everything is possible. And then they would be in my hands. So even though in actual fact the plant was only trying me out, and had not included me on any list at all, the kitchen kept on feeding me just in case. But one day before my fall, when even the plant didn't know, the camp kitchen already knew all about it, and slammed the door in my mug. I had turned out to be a cheap sucker. This tiny episode typifies the atmosphere of the camp world. This so prevalent human desire to be set apart by clothes discloses us in fact, particularly to the keen eyes of camp. It seems to us that we're clothing ourselves, but in fact we're bearing ourselves. We're showing what we're worth. I did not understand that my military uniform had the same price as Matronina's red scarf. But there was an unslumbering eye which had spied it all out from a hiding place, and one day an orderly was sent to get me. A lieutenant wanted to see me, over here, in a separate room. The young lieutenant conversed with me very pleasantly. In the cosy, clean room he and I were alone. The sun was shining just before sinking in the west, and the wind was blowing the curtain. He told me to be seated. For some reason he asked me to write my autobiography, and he could not have made a more pleasant proposal. After the protocols of interrogation in which I had only spat on myself, after the humiliation of the Black Mariahs and the transit prisons, after the convoy and the prison jailers, after the thieves and the trustees who had refused to see in me a former captain of our glorious Red Army, here I sat behind a desk, and without being pushed by anyone at all, and beneath the benign glance of a friendly lieutenant, I wrote at just the right length in thick ink on excellent smooth paper, which did not exist in camp, that I had been a captain, that I had commanded a battery, that I had been awarded some decorations. And thanks to the actual writing, it seemed that I had regained my own personality, my own I. Yes, my gnoseological subject, I. And yet I was, after all, a university man, a civilian in the army by chance. Imagine how embedded it must be in a career officer, this insistence on being held in esteem. And the lieutenant, on reading my autobiography, was quite satisfied with it. "So, you are a Soviet person, right?" Well, to be sure. Well, of course, why not? How pleasant it was to rise again from the mud and ashes and once again become a Soviet person. It was one half of freedom. The lieutenant asked me to come to see him in 5 days. During these 5 days, however, I was forced to say goodbye to my military uniform because it was bad to be digging clay in it. I hid my field shirt and my military breeches in my suitcase, and at the camp storage room I received some patched and faded rag, which appeared to have been washed after lying for a year in a trash bin. This was an important step, though I did not as yet recognize its significance. My soul had not yet become that of a Zek, but my skin therewith became a Zek's. With shaven head, tormented by hunger and squeezed by enemies, I would soon acquire the glance of a Zek, too, insincere, suspicious, all-observant. This was how I looked when in 5 days' time I went to see the security chief, still not understanding what he was getting at. But the security chief was not there. He had stopped coming there entirely. He already knew, but we did not, that in another week we would all be dispersed, and that they would be bringing Germans to Novi Jerusalem to replace us. And that is how I missed seeing the lieutenant. I discussed with Gamarov and Ingal why it was that I wrote my autobiography, and we did not guess, innocents, that these were already the first claws of the beast of prey reaching into our nest. And yet, meanwhile, the picture was so clear. 3 young men had arrived in the new prisoner transport, and they kept discussing something all the time, arguing among themselves, and one of them, swarthy, round and gloomy, with little moustaches, the one who had gotten himself a place in the bookkeeping office, didn't sleep nights and kept writing something on the bunks, writing and hiding it. Of course, one could send someone and grab what he was hiding, but without causing an alarm, it was simpler to find out about it all from one of them who wore army breeches. He evidently was an army man and a Soviet person, and he would assist in the spiritual surveillance. Zhora Ingal, who was not exhausted by his work during the day, really did refuse to sleep the first half nights, and thus defended the freedom of the creative spirit. He sat up on the upper panel of the multiple bunk, without mattress, pillow, or blanket, in his padded jacket. It was not warm in the rooms, for the nights were autumn nights. In his shoes, his feet stretched out on the panel, his back leaning against the wall, and sucking on his pencil, looking sternly at his sheet of paper. One could not have dreamed up worse behavior for camp, but neither he nor we understood yet how all that stood out like a sore thumb, and how they kept watch over such things. Sometimes he simply gave in to his frailties and wrote an ordinary letter. His 23-year-old wife had not even worn out the shoes in which she'd gone with him that winter to the conservatory. And now she had left him. Security questionnaires, a blot on one's record, yes, and a person wants to live. He wrote to another woman, whom he called a dear sister, concealing from himself and from her that he also loved her, or was ready to love her. But that woman, too, soon got married. He could write like this: My dear little sister, hearken to the wonderful intimations of humanity, Handel, Tchaikovsky, Debussy. I, too, wanted to become an intimation, but the clock of my life has come to a stop. Or simply, you have become much closer to me during the course of these months. It has become clear that there are very many real, genuine people in the world, and I very much hope that your husband will also be a real human being. Or like this: I have wandered through life, stumbling and in search of myself. There is a bright light in the room, and I have never seen darkness that is blacker. But only here have I found myself and my own fate, and this time not in books either. And do you know, my little bird, I have never been such an optimist as I am right now. Now I know once and for all that there is nothing more precious in life than the idea one serves, and I also now know how and what I must write. That's the main thing. No, he did not yet know how to write. According to the account of Arkady Belinkov, later on in another camp, Ingal kept on writing like that, keeping to himself on the bunks. The prisoners first asked, and then subsequently began to demand, that he show them what he was writing. Denunciations, perhaps? But regarding this only as one more act of violence against creative art, although from the opposite direction, he refused, and they beat him up unmercifully. I have quoted here these lines from his letters so that his grave may be marked with this tiny monument, at least. And for the time being, he wrote at night and hid during the day a story about El Campesino, the Spanish Republican with whom he had shared a cell, and whose peasant common sense had delighted him. El Campesino's fate was a simple one. After having lost the war to Franco, he came to the Soviet Union, and after a while he was imprisoned here. Engel could never complete this short story about El Campesino because he never knew El Campesino's fate. El Campesino outlived his describer. I have heard that at the time of the great Ashgabat earthquake, he led a group of Zeks out of a wrecked camp and shepherded them through the mountains into Iran. Even the border guards had panicked. Engel was not a warm person. He did not inspire one to open one's heart to him at the first impulse. I have just written this and stopped to think, was I called a warm person either? But his steadfastness was a worthy model, to write in camp. I might someday be able to rise to it if I didn't perish. But for the time being I was tormented by my own restless search, depressed by my first days as a clay digger. On a serene September evening, Boris Gamarov and I could find time only to sit a while on a pile of cinders at the approach to the camp perimeter. In the direction of Moscow, 37 miles away, the heavens flamed with salutes. This was the holiday of victory over Japan, but the lanterns of our camp compound burned with a dull, tired light. A hostile, reddish light emanated from the plant windows. And in a long and drawn-out string, as mysterious as the years and the months of our prison terms, the lanterns on the poles of the broad brickyard compound receded into the distance. Arms around his knees, thin and coughing, Gamarov repeated, "For 30 years I have nurtured my love for my native land, and I shall neither expect your leniency nor desire it." "They brought the fascists! They brought the fascists!" was a cry heard not only in Novi Jerusalem. In the late summer and autumn of 1945, that's how it was on all the islands of the archipelago. Our arrival, that of the fascists, opened up the road to freedom for the non-political offenders. They had learned of their amnesty back on July the 7th. Since that time they had been photographed, and their release documents had been readied, and their accounts in the bookkeeping offices. But first for 1 month, then in places for 2, and in some places for 3 months, the amnestied Zeks had been languishing within the nauseating barbed wire boundaries. There was no one to replace them. There was no one to replace them. And we, newborn, blind innocents that we were, in our corked-up cells, had continued to hope all spring and summer for an amnesty, that Stalin would take pity on us, that he would take account of the victory, that having passed us over in the first, the July amnesty, he would subsequently declare a second amnesty, a special amnesty for political prisoners. They used to report even one detail. This amnesty was already prepared, it was lying on Stalin's desk, and all that was left was for him to sign it. But he was off on vacation. The incorrigibles awaited a genuine amnesty. The incorrigibles believed. But if we had been pardoned, then who would have gone down into the mines? Who would have gone into the forests with saws? Who would have fired the bricks and laid them in walls? Stalin had managed to create a system under which, if it had manifested generosity or mercy, pestilence, famine, desolation, and ruin would have immediately embraced the entire country. "They've brought the fascists!" They had always hated us, or at least disdained us, but now the non-political offenders looked upon us almost with love, because we had come to take their places. And those same prisoners who had learned, in German captivity, that there is no nation more despised, more abandoned, more alien and unneeded than the Russian, now learned, leaping down from red cattle cars and trucks onto the Russian earth, that even among this outcast people, they were the most benighted and grievous of all. Now that is what that great Stalinist amnesty turned out to be, one such as the world had never seen. Where indeed had the world ever seen an amnesty which did not concern politicals? It freed 58s who had sentences of up to 3 years, a sentence almost never given anyone, probably not as many as 0.5% of those to whom it applied. But even among that 0.5% of the cases, the implacable spirit of the amnesty proved stronger than its conciliatory wording. I knew one lad, his name I believe was Matyushin, he was an artist in the little camp at the Kaluga gates, who had been sentenced under 58(1)B very early on, even before the end of 1941, for having been taken prisoner when it had not yet been decided how this was to be treated or what term to give.
This book is continued on Cassette 6, Side 1. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2, Section 1, continued. Cassette 6, Side 1.
I knew one lad, his name I believe was Matyushin, he was an artist in the little camp at the Kaluga gates, who had been sentenced under 58(1)B very early on, even before the end of 1941, for having been taken prisoner when it had not yet been decided how this was to be treated or what term to give. They gave Matyushin just 3 years, an unbelievable happening. At the end of his term he was, of course, not freed, but was told to await the special decree. But then came the amnesty. Matyushin began to ask, there was no way he could demand, for release. For almost 5 months, until December 1945, the frightened officials of the Classification and Records Section turned him down. Finally, he was released to go back home to Kursk province. There was a rumor, and it's quite impossible to believe in any other outcome, that soon afterward he was raked in and given something up to a whole tenor. It was impermissible to allow him to take advantage of the absent-mindedness of the First Court. All those who had burglarized apartments, stolen the clothes of passers-by, raped girls, corrupted minors, given consumers short weight, played the hoodlum, disfigured the defenseless, been wantonly destructive in forests and waterways, committed bigamy, practiced blackmail or extortion, taken bribes, swindled, slandered, written false denunciations, but those particular people didn't actually even serve time at all. That's for the future. Peddled narcotics, pimped or forced women into prostitution, whose carelessness or ignorance had resulted in the loss of life, all went scot-free. And I have merely listed here the articles of the Code covered by the amnesty. This is not a mere flourish of eloquence. And then they want morality from the people. Half their terms were eliminated for embezzlers, forgers of documents and ration cards, speculators, and thieves of state property. Stalin still was touchy about the pockets of the state. But there was nothing so repugnant to the former front-line soldiers and POWs as the universal blanket pardon of deserters in wartime. Every man who, out of cowardice, ran away from his unit, left the front, did not show up at the conscription point, hid for many years in a pit in the vegetable garden of his mother's home, in cellars, behind the stove, always at the mother's. Deserters, as a rule, did not trust their wives, who for years had not pronounced one word aloud, who had turned into hunched-up, hairy beasts. All of them, as long as they had been caught or had turned themselves in by the day of the amnesty, were proclaimed now unsullied, unjudged, equal Soviet citizens. And that is when the perspicacity of the old proverb was justified. Flight is not beautiful, but it is healthy. And those who trembled not, who did not play the card, who for their motherland took the enemy's blow and then paid for it with captivity, there could be no forgiveness for them. That's how the Supreme Commander-in-Chief saw it. Was it that something in the deserters struck a chord in Stalin? Did he remember his own aversion to serving as a rank-and-file soldier, his own pitiful service as a recruit in the winter of 1917? Or did he simply conclude that cowards represented no danger to his rule, and that only the bold were dangerous? After all, it might seem that it was not at all reasonable to amnesty deserters, even from Stalin's point of view. He himself had shown his people the surest and simplest way to save one's skin in any future war. And very likely there was also an historical justice here. An old debt was paid to deserting from the front, without which our whole history would have gone quite differently. In another book, I have told the story of Dr. Zhubov and his wife. An old woman in their house hid a wandering deserter, who later on turned them in for it. For this, the Zhubovs, husband and wife, got sentences of a tenner each under Article 58. The court determined that their guilt lay not so much in hiding a deserter as in the absence of any self-serving motive for this concealment. He was not a relative of theirs, which meant that it amounted to anti-Soviet intent. Under the Stalinist amnesty, the deserter himself was liberated without having served even 3 years, and he had already forgotten about that little episode of his life. But things went differently with the Zhubovs. They each served out a full 10 years in camp, 4 in special camps, and another 4 years without any sentence in exile. They were released only because exile in general was done away with, nor were their convictions annulled either when they were released, not even after 16 years, nor even 19 years after the events. And because of them, they could not return to their home near Moscow, and were prevented from quietly living out their lives. In 1958, the chief military prosecutor replied to them, "Your guilt was proven, and there are no bases for reconsidering the case." Only in 1962, after 20 years, was their case under Section 5810, anti-Soviet intent, and 5811, an organization of husband and wife, quashed. Under Article 193.17.7g, aiding a deserter, it was determined that their sentence was 5 years, and after 20 years, the Stalinist amnesty was applied. And that's precisely the way in which the 2 old people whose lives had been smashed were notified in 1962. As of July the 7th, 1945, you are considered released and your conviction annulled. Now that's what the rancorous, vengeful, unreasonable law fears, and what it does not fear. After the amnesty, they began to smear and smear with the paintbrushes of the cultural and educational sections, and the internal archways and walls of the camps were decorated with mocking slogans. For the broadest amnesty, we shall respond to our dear party and government with doubled productivity. The ones amnestied were the habitual criminals and non-political offenders, and the ones to respond with doubled work productivity were the politicals. When in history has our government shone with a sense of humor? With our fascist arrival, daily releases began immediately in Novi Jerusalem. Just the day before, you had seen women in the camp compound looking disgraceful, dressed in tatters, using profanity, and lo, they had suddenly been transformed, gotten washed, smoothed down their hair, and put on dresses with polka dots and stripes, which they'd got hold of heaven knows where, and with jackets over their arms they went modestly to the station. Seeing them on the train, would you ever guess that they knew how to swear like troopers? And there, leaving the gates, were thieves and half-breeds, who imitate the real thieves. They didn't drop their impudent bearing even there. They clowned and minced and waved to those left behind and shouted, and their friends shouted back to them from the windows. The guards didn't interfere. The thieves are permitted everything. One thief, not without imagination, stood his suitcase on end, climbed up on top of it lightly, and cocking his cap and tossing back the flaps of his jacket, copped off at a transit prison somewhere, or won at cards, played a farewell serenade to the camp on his mandolin, singing some sort of thieves' twaddle. Horse laughs. Those released still had a long walk on the path circling the camp and on through the field, and the folds of the barbed wire did not shut off from us the open view. That night those thieves would be strolling on the boulevards of Moscow, and perhaps even in their first week they would make their jump, clean out an apartment. They'd take the clothes off your wife or sister or daughter on the night streets. And as for you fascists, and Matronina was also a fascist, double your work productivity. Because of the amnesty, there was a shortage of manpower everywhere, and there were rearrangements. For a short time, I was switched from the clay pit to a plant section. There I could take a look at Matronina's mechanization. Everyone had it bad here, but the most surprising of all was the work of one young girl, a real, genuine heroine of labor, though not suitable for the newspaper. Her place, her duty, in the shop had no name, but one could have called it the upper distributor. Next to the conveyor belt emerging from the press with cut, wet bricks, just mixed from clay and very heavy, stood two girls, one of them the lower distributor, and the other the server-up. These did not have to bend down, but simply pivot, and not in a wide-angle turn either. But the upper distributor, who stood on a pedestal like the queen of the shop, had incessantly to bend down, pick up a wet brick placed at her feet by the server-up, and without crushing it, raise it to the level of her waist or even shoulders, and without changing the position of her feet, turn from the waist at a 90-degree angle, sometimes to the right and sometimes to the left, depending on which receiving car was being loaded, and distribute the bricks on 5 wooden shelves, 12 on each. Her motion had no intermission, did not stop or change, and she moved at the speed of fast gymnastics for the whole 8-hour shift, unless the press itself broke down. They kept handing and handing her half of all the bricks produced by the plant during a shift. Down below, the girls switched duties, but she had no replacement for the entire 8 hours. She ought to have grown dizzy from 5 minutes of such work, from those swings of her head and the bending and twisting of her torso. During the first half of her shift, however, the girl still kept her smile. She couldn't carry on a conversation because of the din of the press, and perhaps she liked being put up there on a pedestal like a beauty queen, where everyone could see her strong, bare legs below her hitched-up skirt and the ballet-like elasticity of her waist. And for this work she got the highest ration in the camp, 10.5 extra ounces of bread, a total for the day of 30 ounces. And for her dinner, besides the common black cabbage soup, 3 Stakhanovite portions, 3 pitiful portions of thin semolina cereal made with water. They gave her so little that she inhaled the full contents of the pottery bowl in one swallow. "We work for money and you work for bread. No secret there," a grubby free mechanic who had come to fix the press said to me. One armed Punin from the Altai and I rolled away the loaded cars. These cars were like high towers, unsteady because, thanks to 10 shelves with 12 bricks each, their center of gravity was high up. Wobbling and tottering like a bookcase overloaded with books, such a car had to be pulled by an iron handle along straight rails, then led up onto a supporting truck, halted there, and then this truck had to be pulled along another straight line past the drying chambers. Brought to a stop at the one required, the car then had to be taken off the truck and pushed ahead of one in still another direction into the drying chamber. Each chamber was a long, narrow corridor, along whose walls stretched 10 slots and 10 shelf supports. One had to push the car right to the back without letting it get out of line, and there release the lever, setting all 10 shelves with the bricks on the 10 supports, and release 10 pairs of iron grips, and immediately roll the empty car back out. This whole scheme, it seems, was German, out of the 19th century, and the car had a German name. But the German scheme provided not only for rails to support the car, but also for a floor laid beneath the pits to support the trucker. But for us, the floor planks were rotten, broken, and I used to stumble and fall through. In addition, there was probably supposed to be ventilation in all the chambers, but there wasn't any, and while I struggled away at my mistakes in stacking, I often got things crooked, shelves got stuck, refused to set, and wet bricks tumbled down on my head. I gulped in carbon fumes, and they burned my windpipe. Therefore, I was not very sorry to leave the plant when I was again driven out to the clay pit. There were not enough clay diggers. They were being released too. They sent Boris Gamma off to the clay pit too, and so we began to work together. The work norm there was well known. During one shift, one worker was to dig, load up, and deliver to the windlass 6 cars full of clay, 8 cubic yards. For 2 persons, the norm was 16. In dry weather, the 2 of us together could manage 6.5. But an autumn drizzle began. For 1 day, 2, 3, without wind, it kept on, getting neither heavier nor stopping. It was not torrential, so no one was going to take the responsibility for halting the outdoor work. "It never rains on the canal," was a famous Gulag slogan. But in Novi Jerusalem, for some reason, they did not even give us padded jackets. And there in the red clay pit, beneath that monotonous drizzle, we wallowed and smeared up our old front-line overcoats, which by the end of the 3rd day had already absorbed a pail of water each. The camp also gave us no footwear, and we were rotting our last front-line boots in the wet clay. The first day we still joked. "And don't you find, Boris, that Baron Tussenbach would have envied us a good deal right now? After all, he dreamed of working in a brickyard. Do you remember? To work so hard that when he came home he would throw himself on his bed and instantly fall asleep. He evidently supposed that there would be a dryer for wet clothes, that there would be a cot and a hot meal consisting of 2 courses. But we rolled away a pair of cars, and angrily knocking our spades against the iron sides of the next car, the clay stuck to the shovels. This time I spoke with irritation. "Just tell me, if you please, what devil made the sisters restless just sitting at home? No one forced them to go out on Sundays with young people to collect scrap. On Mondays no one required of them a précis of the Holy Scriptures. No one forced them to teach for nothing. No one drove them out into the blocks to put into effect universal education." And after one more load, what empty, empty chatter they all indulged in. To work, to work, to work. Well, go ahead and work, the hell with you, who's stopping you. What a happy life it will be. So happy, so happy. And what will it be like? You should have been accompanied by police dogs into that happy life. You'd have learned. Boris was weaker than I. He could hardly wield his spade, which the sticky clay made heavier and heavier, and he could hardly throw each shovelful up to the edge of the truck. Nonetheless, on the 2nd day, he tried to keep us up to the heights of Vladimir Soloviev. He had outdistanced me there, too. How much of Soloviev he had already read, and I had not read even 1 line because of my Bessel functions. He told me whatever he remembered, and I kept trying to remember it, but I really couldn't. I didn't have the head for it at that moment. No, how can one preserve one's life and at the same time arrive at the truth? And why is it necessary to be dropped into the depths of camp in order to understand one's own squalor? He said, "Vladimir Soloviev taught that one must greet death with gladness. Worse than here, it won't be." Quite true. We loaded as much as we could. Penalty ration? So it would be a penalty ration. The hell with you. We wrote off the day and wound our way to camp. But there was nothing joyful awaiting us there. 3 times a day that same black, unsalted infusion of nettle leaves, and once a day a ladle of thin gruel, 1/3 of a litre. And the bread had already been sliced. They gave 15.25 ounces in the morning, and not a crumb more during the day or in the evening. And then we were lined up for roll call out in the rain. And once again we slept on bare bunks in wet clothes, muddied with clay, and we shivered because they weren't heating the barracks. And the next day that fine drizzle kept falling and falling. The clay pit had got drenched, and we were stuck in it, but good. No matter how much clay you took on your spade, and no matter how much you banged it on the side of the truck, the clay would not drop off, and each time we had to reach over and push the clay off the spade into the car. And then we realized that we had been merely doing extra work. We put aside the spades and began simply to gather up the squelching clay from under our feet and toss it into the car. Boria was coughing. There was still a fragment of German tank shell in his lungs. He was thin and yellow, and his nose, ears, and the bones of his face had grown deathly pointed. I looked at him closely, and I was not sure. Would he make it through a winter in camp? We still tried to divert our minds and conquer our situation with thought, but by then neither philosophy nor literature was there. Even our hands became heavy, like spades, and hung down. Boris suggested, "No, to talk takes much strength. Let's be silent and think to some purpose. For example, compose verses in our heads." I shuddered. He could write verses here and now. The canopy of death hung over him, but the canopy of such a stubborn talent hung over his yellow forehead, too. That winter, Boris Galmarov died in a hospital from exhaustion and tuberculosis. I revere in him a poet who was never even allowed to peep. His spiritual image was lofty, and his verses themselves seemed to me very powerful at the time. But I did not memorize even one of them, and I can find them nowhere now, so as to be able at least to make him a gravestone from those little stones. And so we kept silent and scooped up the clay with our hands. The rain kept coming. Yet they not only didn't take us out of the clay pit, but Matronina, brandishing the fiery sword of her gaze, her red head was covered with a dark shawl, pointed out to the brigadier from the edge the different ends of the clay pit, and we understood. They were not going to pull out the brigade at the end of its shift at 2 p.m., but would keep it in the clay pit until it fulfilled its norm. Only then would we get both lunch and dinner. In Moscow, the construction project was halted for lack of bricks. But Matronina departed, and the rain thickened. Light red puddles formed everywhere in the clay, and in our car, too. The tops of our boots turned red, and our coats were covered with red spots. Our hands had grown numb from the cold clay, and by this time we couldn't even throw anything into the car. And then we left this futile occupation, climbed up higher to the grass, sat down there, bent our heads, and pulled the collars of our coats up over the backs of our necks. From the side, we looked like two reddish stones in the field. Somewhere, young men of our age were studying at the Sorbonne or at Oxford, playing tennis during their ample hours of relaxation, arguing about the problems of the world in student cafes. They were already being published and were exhibiting their paintings. They were twisting and turning to find ways of distorting the insufficiently original world around them in some new way. They railed against the classics for exhausting all the subjects and themes. They railed at their own governments and their own reactionaries, who did not want to comprehend and adopt the advanced experience of the Soviet Union. They recorded interviews through the microphones of radio reporters, listening all the time to their own voices and coquettishly elucidating what they wished to say in their last or their first book. They judged everything in the world with self-assurance, but particularly the prosperity and higher justice of our country. Only at some point in their old age, in the course of compiling encyclopedias, would they notice with astonishment that they could not find any worthy Russian names for our letters, for all the letters of our alphabet. The rain drummed on the back of our heads, and the chill crept up our wet backs. We looked about us. The half-loaded cars had been overturned. Everyone had left. There was no one in the entire clay pit, nor in the entire field beyond the compound. Out in the grey curtain of rain lay the hidden village, and even the roosters had hidden in a dry place. We, too, picked up our spades so that no one would steal them. They were registered in our names. And dragging them behind us like heavy wheelbarrows, we went around Matronina's plant beneath the shed where empty galleries wound all around the Hoffman kilns that fired the bricks. There were draughts here, and it was cold, but it was also dry. We pushed ourselves down into the dust beneath the brick archway and sat there. Not far away from us, a big heap of coal was piled. Two Zeks were digging into it, eagerly seeking something there. When they found it, they tried it in their teeth, then put it in their sack. Then they sat themselves down and each ate a similar black-grey lump. What are you eating there, fellows? It's sea clay. The doctor doesn't forbid it. It doesn't do any good, but it doesn't do any harm either. And if you add a kilo of it a day to your rations, it's as if you had really eaten. Go on, look for some. There's a lot of it among the coal. And so it was that right up to nightfall the clay pit did not fulfill its work norm. Matronina gave orders that we should be left out all night. But the electricity went out everywhere, and the work compound had no lights, so they called everyone into the gatehouse. They ordered us to link arms, and with a beefed-up convoy to the barking of the dogs and to curses, they took us to the camp compound. Everything was black. We moved along without seeing where it was wet and where the earth was firm, kneading it all up in succession, losing our footing and jerking one another. And in the camp compound it was dark. Only a hellish glow came from beneath the burners for individual cooking. And in the mess hall 2 kerosene lamps burned next to the serving window, and you could not read the slogan, nor see the double portion of nettle gruel in the bowl, and you sucked it down with your lips by feel. And tomorrow would be the same, and every day, 6 cars of red clay, 3 scoops of black gruel. In prison, too, we seemed to have grown weak, but here it went much faster. There was already a ringing in the head. That pleasant weakness in which it is easier to give in than to fight back kept coming closer. And in the barracks, total darkness. We lay there dressed in everything wet, on everything bare, and it seemed it was warmer not to take anything off, like a poultice. Open eyes looked at the black ceiling, at the black heavens. Good Lord, good Lord, beneath the shells and the bombs I begged you to preserve my life. And now I beg you, please, send me death. Chapter 7. The Way of Life and Customs of the Natives. To describe the native life in all its outward monotony would seem to be both very easy and very readily attainable. Yet it is very difficult at the same time. As with every different way of life, one has to describe the round of living from one morning until the next, from one winter to the next, from birth, arrival in one's first camp, until death, and simultaneously describe everything about all the many islands and islets that exist. No one is capable of encompassing all this, of course, and it would merely be a bore to read whole volumes. And the life of the natives consists of work, 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 of starvation, cold, and cunning. This work, for those who are unable to push others out of the way and set themselves up in a soft spot, is that self-same general work which raises socialism up out of the earth and drives us down into the earth. One cannot enumerate nor cover all the different aspects of this work, nor wrap your tongue about them. To push a wheelbarrow, oh, the machine of the OSO, 2 handles and 1 wheel, so. To carry hand barrows, to unload bricks bare-handed, the skin quickly wears off the fingers. To haul bricks on one's own body by goat in a shoulder barrow. To break up stone and coal in quarry and mine, to dig clay and sand. To hack out 8 cubic yards of gold-bearing ore with a pick and haul them to the screening apparatus. Yes, and just to dig in the earth, just to chew up earth, flinty soil, and in winter, to cut coal underground. And there are ores there, too, lead and copper. Yes, and one can also pulverize copper ore, a sweet taste in the mouth, and one waters at the nose. One can impregnate ties with creosote, and one's whole body at the same time, too. One can carve out tunnels for railroads and build roadbeds. One can dig peat in the bog up to one's waist in the mud. One can smelt ores. One can cast metal. One can cut hay on hummocks in swampy meadows, sinking up to one's ankles in water. One can be a stableman or a drayman, yes, and steal oats from the horse's bag for one's own pot, but the horse's government issued the old grass bag, and she'll last it out, most likely, but you can drop dead. Yes, and generally at the selkhozy, the agricultural camps, you can do every kind of peasant work, and there is no work better than that. You'll grab something from the ground for yourself. But the father of all is our Russian forest with its genuinely golden tree trunks. Gold is mined from them. And the oldest of all the kinds of work in the archipelago is logging. It summons everyone to itself and has room for everyone. And it is not even out of bounds for cripples. They will send out a 3-man gang of armless men to stamp down the 1.5-foot snow. Snow comes up to your chest. You are a lumberjack. First you yourself stamp it down next to the tree trunk. You cut down the tree. Then, hardly able to make your way through the snow, you cut off all the branches, and you have to feel them out in the snow and get to them with your axe. Still dragging your way through the same loose snow, you have to carry off all the branches and make piles of them and burn them. They smoke. They don't burn. And now you have to saw up the wood to size and stack it. And the work norm for you and your brother for the day is 6.5 cubic yards each, or 13 cubic yards for 2 men working together. In Borepolom, the norm was 9 cubic yards, but the thick pieces also had to be split into blocks. By then your arms would not be capable of lifting an axe, nor your feet of moving. During the war years, on war rations, the camp inmates called 3 weeks at logging dry execution. You come to hate this forest, this beauty of the earth, whose praises have been sung in verse and prose. You come to walk beneath the arches of pine and birch with a shudder of revulsion. For decades in the future, you only have to shut your eyes to see those same fir and aspen trunks which you have hauled on your back to the freight car, sinking into the snow and falling down and hanging on to them tight, afraid to let go lest you prove unable to lift them out of the snowy mash. Work at hard labor in Tsarist Russia was limited for decades by the normative statutes of 1869, which were actually issued for free persons. In assigning work, the physical strength of the worker and the degree to which he was accustomed to it were taken into consideration. Can one nowadays really believe this? The workday was set at 7 hours in winter and at 12.5 hours in summer. At the ferocious Akatui Hard Labor Center, Yakubovich in the 1890s, the work norms were easily fulfilled by everyone except him. The summer work-day there amounted to 8 hours, including walking to and from work. And from October on it was 7 hours, and in winter only 6. And this was even before any struggle for the universal 8-hour work-day. As for Dostoevsky's hard labor in Omsk, it is clear that in general they simply loafed about, as any reader can establish. The work there was agreeable and went with a swing, and the prison administration there even dressed them up in white linen jackets and trousers. Now, how much further could they have gone? In our camps, they used to say, you could even put on a white collar, which meant things were very, very easy and there was absolutely nothing to do. And they had even white jackets. After work, the hard labor convicts of the House of the Dead used to spend a long time strolling around the prison courtyard. That means that they were not totally fagged out. Indeed, the Tsarist censor did not want to pass the manuscript of the House of the Dead for fear that the easiness of the life depicted by Dostoevsky would fail to deter people from crime. And so Dostoevsky added new pages for the censor which demonstrated that life in hard labor was nonetheless hard. In our camps, only the trustees went strolling round on Sundays. Yes, and even they hesitated to. And Shalamov remarks with respect to the notes of Maria Volkonskaya that the Decembrist prisoners in Nerchinsk had a norm of 118 pounds of ore to mine and load each day. 118 pounds? One could lift that all at once. Whereas Shalamov on the Kolyma had a work norm per day of 28,800 pounds. And Shalamov writes that in addition their summer work-day was sometimes 16 hours long. I don't know how it was with 16, but for many it was 13 hours long on earth-moving work in Gulag and at the northern logging operations, and these were hours on the job itself, over and above the 3 miles walk to the forest and 3 back. And anyway, why should we argue about the length of the day? After all, the work norm was senior in rank to the length of the workday, and when the brigade didn't fulfill the norm, the only thing that was changed at the end of the shift was the convoy, and the work sloggers were left in the woods by the light of searchlights until midnight, so that they got back to the camp just before morning, in time to eat their dinner along with their breakfast and go out into the woods again. Those who increase work norms in industry can still deceive themselves into thinking that such are the successes of the technology of production. But those who increase the norms of physical labor are executioners par excellence. They cannot seriously believe that under socialism the human being is twice as big and twice as muscular. They are the ones who should be tried. They are the ones who should be sent out to fulfill those work norms. There is no one to tell about it either. They all died. And then here's another way they raised the norms and proved it was possible to fulfill them. In cold, lower than 60 degrees below zero, work days were written off. In other words, on such days the records showed that the workers had not gone out to work, but they chased them out anyway, and whatever they squeezed out of them on those days was added to the other days, thereby raising the percentages. And the servile medical section wrote off those who froze to death on such cold days on some other basis. And the ones who were left who could no longer walk and were straining every sinew to crawl along on all fours on the way back to camp, the convoy simply shot, so that they wouldn't escape before they could come back to get them. And how did they feed them in return? They poured water into a pot, and the best one might expect was that they would drop unscrubbed small potatoes into it, but otherwise black cabbage, beet tops, all kinds of trash. Or else vetch or bran. They didn't begrudge these. And wherever there was a water shortage, as there was at the Samarkand camp near Karaganda, only one bowl of gruel was cooked a day, and they also gave out a ration of 2 cups of turbid, salty water. Everything any good was always and without fail stolen for the chiefs, see Chapter 9, for the trustees and for the thieves. The cooks were all terrorized, and it was only by submissiveness that they kept their jobs. Certain amounts of fat and meat sub-products, in other words, not real food, were signed out from the warehouses, as were fish, peas, and cereals, but not much of that ever found its way into the mouth of the pot. And in remote places the chiefs even took all the salt for themselves for their own pickling. In 1940, on the Kotlas-Vorkuta Railroad, both the bread and the gruel were unsalted. The worse the food, the more of it they gave the zeks. They used to give them horse meat from exhausted horses driven to death at work. And even though it was quite impossible to chew it, it was a feast. Ivan Dobriak recalls today, "In my own time I have pushed no small amount of dolphin meat into my mouth, also walrus, seal, sea bear, and all kinds of other sea animal trash." I interrupt. We ate whale meat in Moscow at the Kaluga gates. I was not even afraid of animal feces, and as for willow herbs, lichens, wild chamomile, they were the very best of dishes. This means he himself went out and added to his rations. It was impossible to try to keep nourished on Gulag norms anyone who worked out in the bitter cold for 13 or even 10 hours, and it was completely impossible once the basic ration had been plundered. And this was where Frenkel's satanic mixing paddle was put into the boiling pot. Some sloggers would be fed at the expense of others. The pots were divvied up. If less than 30% of the norm, and in each different camp this was calculated in a different way, was fulfilled, the ration issued you was a punishment block ration, 10.5 ounces of bread and a bowl of gruel a day. For from 30 to 80% of norm, they issued a penalty ration of 14 ounces of bread a day and 2 bowls of gruel. For from 81 to 100%, you got a work ration of from 17.5 to 21 ounces of bread and 3 bowls of gruel. And after that came the shark workers' pots, and they differed among themselves, running from 24.5 to 31.5 ounces of bread a day, and supplementary kasha portions, 2 portions, and the bonus dish, which was some kind of dark, bitterish, rye dough fingers stuffed with peas. And for all this watery food, which could not possibly cover what the body expended, the muscles burned up at body-rending toil. The shock workers and Stakhanovites went into the ground sooner than did the malingerers. This was something the old camp veterans understood very well, and it was covered by their own saying, "Better not to give me an extra kasha, and not to wake me up for work. If such a happy stroke of fortune befalls you, as to be allowed to stay on your bunk for lack of clothing, you'll get the guaranteed 21 ounces. If they have dressed you up for the season," and this is a famous Gulag expression, "and taken you out to work on the canal, even if you wear your sledgehammer down to a chisel, you'll never get more than 10.5 ounces out of the frozen soil." But the Zek was not at liberty to stay on his bunk. Of course, they did not feed the Zeks so badly everywhere and always, but these are typical figures for Kraslag in wartime. At Vorkuta, in that same period, the miner's ration was, in all likelihood, the highest in all of Gulag, because heroic Moscow was being heated with that coal. It was 45.5 ounces for 80% of norm underground, or 100% on the surface. And in that most horribly murderous Tsarist hard-labor Akatui, on a non-working day, spent on the bunk, they used to give out 2.5 Russian pounds of bread, 35 ounces, as well as 32 zolotniks, in other words, 4.65 ounces of meat. And on a working day, there they gave out 3 Russian pounds, 43 ounces of bread, and 48 zolotniks, 7 ounces of meat. Was that not maybe higher than the front-line ration in the Red Army? And the Akatui prisoners carted off their gruel and their kasha by the tubful to the jailer's pigs. And P. Yakubovich found their thin porridge made from buckwheat kasha, Gulag never even saw that, inexpressibly repulsive to the taste. Danger of death from malnutrition is something else that never hung over the hard-labor convicts of Dostoevsky's book. And what can you say if geese went wandering around in their prison yard, in the camp compound, and the prisoners didn't wring their necks? On the basis of the standards of many harsh camps, Shalamov justly reproached me. "And what kind of a hospital cat was it that was walking around where you were? Why hadn't they killed it and eaten it long before?" The bread at Tsarist Akatui was set out on their tables unrestricted, and at Christmas they were given a pound of beef and unlimited butter for their cereal. On Sakhalin, the Tsarist prisoners working on roads and in mines during the months of the most work received each day 56 ounces of bread, 14 ounces of meat, 8 3/4 ounces of cereal. And the conscientious Chekhov investigated whether these norms were really enough, or whether, in view of the inferior quality of the baking and cooking, they fell short. And if he had looked into the bowl of our Soviet slogger, he would have given up the ghost right then and there. What imagination at the beginning of our century could have pictured that after 30 or 40 years, not just on Sakhalin alone, but throughout the entire archipelago, prisoners would be glad to get even more soggy, dirty, slack-baked bread, with admixtures of the devil only knew what, and the 24.5 ounces of it would be an enviable shock-worker ration. No, even more, that throughout all Russia the collective farmers would even envy that prisoner's ration. We don't get even that, after all. Even at the Tsar's Nerchinsk mines they gave a supplementary gold prospectors payment for everything over the government norm, which was always moderate. In our camps, for most of the years of the archipelago, they either paid nothing for labor or just as much as was required for soap and tooth powder. Only in those rare camps and in those short periods when for some reason they introduced cost accounting, and only from 1/8 to 1/4 of the genuine wage was credited to the prisoner, could the Zeks buy bread, meat, and sugar. And all of a sudden, oh, astonishment, a crust would be left on the mess hall table, and it might be there for all of 5 minutes, without anyone reaching out a hand to grab it. And how were our natives dressed and shod? All archipelagos are like all archipelagos. The blue ocean rolls about them, coconut palms grow on them, and the administration of the islands does not assume the expense of clothing the natives. They go about barefoot and almost naked. But as for our cursed archipelago, it would have been quite impossible to picture it beneath the hot sun. It was eternally covered with snow, and the blizzards eternally raged over it. And in addition to everything else, it was necessary to clothe and to shoe all that horde of 10 to 15 million prisoners. According to the estimates of the Encyclopedia Rossiya SSSR, there were up to 15 million prisoners at a time. This figure agrees with the estimate made by prisoners inside the USSR, as we ourselves have added it up. Whenever they publish more proven figures, we will accept them. Fortunately, born outside the bounds of the archipelago, the Czechs arrived here not altogether naked. This book is continued at this point, on the other side of this cassette. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 2, Section 1, continued. Cassette 6, Side 2. Fortunately, born outside the bounds of the archipelago, the Czechs arrived here not altogether naked. They wore what they came in, more accurately what the socially friendly elements might leave of it, except that, as a brand of the archipelago, a piece had to be torn off, just as they clip one ear of the ram. Greatcoats have their flaps cut off diagonally. Boudeni helmets have the high peak cut off, so as to leave a draught through the top. But alas, the clothing of free men is not eternal, and footgear can be in shreds in a week from the stumps and hummocks of the archipelago. And therefore it is necessary to clothe the natives, even though they have nothing with which to pay for the clothing. Some day the Russian stage will yet see this sight, and the Russian cinema screen. The pea jackets one colour and their sleeves another, or so many patches on the pea jacket that its original cloth is totally invisible, or a flaming pea jacket with tatters on it like tongues of flame, or patches on breeches made from the wrappings of someone's food parcel from home, and for a long while to come one can still read the address written in the corner with an indelible pencil. In Tsarist Akatui, the prisoners were given fur overcoats, and on their feet the tried and true Russian lapti, bast sandals, except that they had no decent onuchi, footcloths, to go with them. Or else they might have a piece of old automobile tire tied right on the bare foot with a wire, an electric cord. Grief has its own inventiveness. Or else there were felt boots, burki, put together from pieces of old, torn-up, padded jackets, with soles made of a layer of thick felt and a layer of rubber. Neither Dostoevsky, nor Chekhov, nor Yakubovich tells us what the prisoners of their own Tsarist times wore on their feet, but of course they were doubtless shod, otherwise they would have written about it. In the morning, at the gatehouse, hearing complaints about the cold, the chief of the camp would reply with his gulag sense of humor. "My goose out there goes around barefoot all winter long and doesn't complain, although it's true her feet are red, and all of you have got rubber overshoes." And then, in addition, bronze-grey camp faces will appear on the screen, eyes oozing with tears, red eyelids, white, cracked lips covered with sores, skewbald, unshaven bristles on the faces. In winter, a summer cap with ear flaps sewn on. I recognize you. It is you, the inhabitants of my archipelago. But no matter how many hours there are in the working day, sooner or later sloggers will return to the barracks. Their barracks? Sometimes it is a dugout dug into the ground, and in the north more often a tent, true, with earth banked and reinforced hit or miss with boards. Often there are kerosene lamps in place of electricity, but sometimes there are the ancient Russian splinter lamps, or else cotton wool wicks. In Ost-Vim, for 2 years, they saw no kerosene, and even in headquarters barracks they got light from oil from the food store. It is by this pitiful light that we will survey this ruined world. Sleeping shelves in 2 stories, sleeping shelves in 3 stories, or, as a sign of luxury, vagonki, multiple bunks, the boards most often bare and nothing at all on them. On some of the work parties they steal so thoroughly and then sell the spoils through the free employees that nothing government issue is given out and no one keeps anything of his own in the barracks. They take both their mess tins and their mugs to work with them, and even tote the bags containing their belongings, and thus laden they dig in the earth. Those who have them put their blankets around their necks, a film scene, or else lug their things to trusty friends in a guarded barracks. During the day the barracks are as empty as if uninhabited. At night they might turn over their wet work clothes to be dried in the dryer, if there is a dryer, but undressed like that you are going to freeze on the bare boards, and so they dry their clothes on themselves. At night their caps may freeze to the wall of the tent, or in a woman's case her hair. They even hide their bast sandals under their heads, so they won't be stolen off their feet, burepolom, during the war. In the middle of the barracks there is an oil drum with holes in it, which has been converted into a stove, and it is good when it gets red hot. Then the steamy odor of drying footcloths permeates the entire barracks. But it sometimes happens that the wet firewood in it doesn't burn. Some of the barracks are so infested with insects that even 4 days' fumigation with burning sulphur doesn't help. And when in the summer the Zeks go out to sleep on the ground in the camp compound, the bedbugs crawl after them and find them even there. And the Zeks boil the lice off their underwear in their mess tins after dining from them. All this became possible only in the 20th century, and comparison here with the prison chroniclers of the past century is to no avail. They didn't write of anything like this. It is necessary to add to all this the picture of the way the brigade's bread is brought on a tray from the bread-cutting room into the mess hall under guard of the huskiest brigade members carrying staves. Otherwise, other prisoners will grab it, tear it apart, and run off with it. And the picture should also be added of the way food parcels from home are knocked out of the Zeks' hands at the very moment they leave the parcel office. And also the constant alarm whether the camp administration is going to take away the rest day. And why talk about the war if for a whole year before the war they had not had one day off on the Ukhta State Farm, and no one in Karlag could remember any rest days from 1937 right through 1945. Then, on top of everything, one has to add the eternal impermanence of camp life, the fear of change, rumors about a prisoner transport, the prisoner transport itself. The hard labor of Dostoevsky's time knew no prisoner transports, and for 10 or even 20 years people served out their term in one prison, and that was a totally different kind of life. Then some sort of dark and sudden shuffling of contingents, either a transfer in the interests of production, or a commissioning by a medical review board, or inventory of property, or sudden night searches that involve undressing and the tearing apart of all the prisoners' meagre rags. And then beyond that, the thorough individual searches before the big holidays of May the 1st and November 7th.
Alright, that's it for today.